Settle now and let the day grow distant. Let the last bright edges of thought soften. Let the mind loosen its careful grip. And imagine, for a little while, that you are walking not forward but backward, backward through years and seasons, through lamplit streets and sleeping houses, through winter fields, quiet rail fences, old courthouses, and forest paths worn by boots long turned to dust. Tonight, you are not entering history as a battlefield of dates and arguments. You are entering it as a house at dusk, a room of stillness, a chair near the fire, a window holding the night. And in that room, waiting in the hush between candlelight and shadow, is a tall, thoughtful figure whose life would one day help steady a broken nation. Not through noise, not through glitter, not through the hunger to be admired, but through patience, restraint, sorrow carried with dignity, and a kind of strength so quiet that it is often mistaken at first for softness. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, not only the public figure carved in marble, not only the president whose words would echo across generations, but the inward man. The boy of the frontier, the reader by firelight, the listener, the sufferer, the soul shaped slowly and almost invisibly by loss, labor, loneliness, and the stubborn belief that human beings might yet rise towards something better. So before the speeches, before the White House, before the burdens of war and the solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend, you are invited to begin where all sleep stories should begin. In the dark, in the quiet, in the small and almost forgotten places where a life is first formed. There is no need to hurry. For the kind of life you are entering tonight was not formed in haste. It was not born into power, nor lifted early into applause. It was shaped in low rooms, under hard skies, among rough work and uncertain prospects. It was shaped by the kind of silence that asks a person what remains when ease is absent. It was shaped by questions that do not arrive all at once, but gather, almost unnoticed, in the depths of a thoughtful mind. If you listen closely, you may feel already what this story is about. Not only leadership, but inward leadership. Not only history, but character. Not only greatness, but the strange and beautiful way greatness may begin in obscurity. Tonight, you are invited to rest beside that obscurity, to leave behind, for a little while, the noise of modern life, the bright sharpness of screens and headlines and haste, and enter instead a more patient rhythm, a rhythm of footsteps on earth, of wind in trees, of paper turned by low light, of a mind becoming itself in the company of hardship and hope. This is not a story of thunder from the beginning. It is a story about embers. A child is half lit by firelight, a room holding quieter than comfort, a life so small on an outward scale that the world would never imagine how far its influence might one day travel. And perhaps that is part of what makes Lincoln's life so consoling to the weary heart. He did not begin finished. He did not begin for certain. He did not begin surrounded by signs of destiny. He began in need, in labor, in sorrow, in listening. There is tenderness in that beginning, and there is also a kind of hope, because it means that what later steadies others may first be formed in places the world does not honor very much. It means that character may ripen far from recognition. It means that silence, though often feared, can become a teacher. So rest here on the threshold. The fire is low, the room is simple, the night gathers at the window, and the story of Abraham Lincoln is about to begin, not in fame, but in stillness. Imagine now the American frontier in the early 19th century. Not the frontier of loud legend, but the real one. Dense woods, mud underfoot, rough-hewn cabins, thin light slipping through trees, the smell of smoke caught in wool and timber, long winters, work before dawn, tools are worn smoothly by the hand. The kind of world where survival itself asks for discipline, and where silence is not an empty thing, but a presence. Now imagine yourself there, not as a stranger, but as a quiet witness. You stand just outside a cabin in the evening. The air is cold enough to sting the skin. Somewhere beyond the trees, the last gray ribbon of daylight is folding into night. Inside, a family gathers close because the world outside is large, dark, and full of uncertainty. There is no luxury here, no polished ease, no illusion that life will be gentle, simply because one wishes it to be so. And yet, there is something here that comfort can never fully teach. Endurance. There is something here that abundance often hides. Attention. And there is something here, too, that would shape the inner architecture of Lincoln's life. An early acquaintance with limits. Limits of money, limits of schooling, limits of safety, limits of what can be promised to any human heart. He would not be raised in an atmosphere of ease or pedigree. He would not inherit scholarly refinement or social rank or a settled sense that the world had made room for him. He would have to make that room slowly, inwardly, through effort, curiosity, and moral patience. As a child, Lincoln received very little formal schooling. By his own account, it amounted only to brief periods, by littles, as he once described it. Yet somehow, through scattered lessons and deep personal effort, he learned to read, write, and cipher, and these modest foundations opened into a lifelong habit of self-education. If you listen closely, you can feel how important that is. He was not shaped by a grand institution at first. He was shaped by hunger, not hunger of the body alone, though he knew that world too, but hunger of the mind. Hunger to understand, hunger to gather meaning from the few books he could find, hunger to place words in order until they could hold truth without ornament. There is something deeply peaceful in that image, a young person in a hard place, reaching not for applause but for understanding. And perhaps this is where quiet leadership truly begins, not in commanding others, but in learning how to govern yourself, how to remain teachable in obscurity, how to build an inner room where thought can deepen before speech emerges. You can almost see him now, though he is still very young, long-limbed already, a little awkward in motion, serious one moment, and unexpectedly full of humor the next. A boy in a world of axes, fields, riverbanks, weather, and chores, yet carrying within him some early sense that language matters, that fairness matters, that even in a rough and restless land, the life of the mind is not a luxury but a shelter. And yet, as with so many souls who later become places of refuge for others, the early years did not pass without sorrow. When Abraham Lincoln was still a boy, his mother died. The loss marked the household deeply, and his emotional life was shaped in part by these early encounters with grief and instability. So now the cabin is growing quieter still. You may imagine the hush that follows a loss too large for a child to name, the way ordinary objects remain in place, and yet everything has changed. A chair, a cup, cloth, the sound of footsteps that will not return. The frontier could teach toughness, yes, but sorrow teaches a different kind of knowledge. It teaches how fragile each life is, how brief warmth can be, how necessary tenderness becomes in a world where so much can vanish. Lincoln would later become known for firmness, for resolve, for the steadiness required in impossible times. But beneath that steadiness, there always seems to have been a tender awareness of suffering, a capacity to recognize the wound beneath the argument, the human ache beneath the public event. Perhaps that too begins here, in the silence after loss, in the young heart, learning that strength without mercy is incomplete. For now, there is no need to hurry the story. The woods remain around you. The cold remains. The stars begin to show themselves one by one above the black line of trees. And inside the little cabin, by dim and uncertain light, a boy is growing. Not quickly, not dramatically, not in the way legends like to pretend. He is growing in fragments, in pauses, in hard seasons, in moments that would have seemed entirely ordinary to anyone watching from nearby. This is one of history's quietest truths. The lives that later alter the world often begin in ways the world would never think to notice. A poor child, a rough home, a small education, a large sorrow, a listening mind. That is enough for the beginning. Let yourself rest there for a moment. Because the pace matters. To understand Abraham Lincoln, you must not approach him as a monument first. Marble is too still, too finished, too certain. The real Lincoln was unfinished for a long time. He was formed by trial and thought, by labor and self-suspicion, by long interior weather. He did not burst into greatness like a torch thrown high into darkness. He gathered slowly like embers. And in that, perhaps, lies part of why so many people, even now, find something deeply human in him. He was not born into power. He worked on farms, split rails, and spent part of his early life doing plain, physically demanding labor before rising through law and politics. You may feel, if only faintly, the beauty of that arc. Not because hardship is beautiful. It is not. But because of hardship, when met with honesty and endurance, there can emerge a kind of compassion that those who have been spared struggle sometimes never fully learn. Lincoln's life would eventually carry him into law, public office, national crisis, and moral reckoning. He would become the first Republican president. He would lead during the Civil War. He would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He would speak words at Gettysburg, and in his second inaugural, that would become part of the moral language of the nation. But not yet. Tonight, in this opening hour of the story, you are invited to resist the urge to jump ahead. Stay with the hidden years. Stay where greatness is still invisible. Stay where a child learns, without knowing it, how to endure obscurity. Stay where silence is becoming one of his first teachers. And so you walk with him in imagination through Indiana woodland, where the earth is uneven and the future gives no sign of itself. Morning comes early in such a place. There is wood to cut, water to draw, fences to mend, fields to tend. Hands become useful long before they become gentle. Muscles learn repetition. The body is claimed by necessity, and yet the mind, if it remains awake, keeps another rhythm. Perhaps you see him pausing at the edge of a task, not to avoid it, but to think, to notice, to turn a phrase over inwardly, to listen to shape and meaning in the world around him. The sound of an axe can teach measure. The turn of seasons can teach patience. The nearness of death can teach seriousness. The scarcity of books can teach reverence for words. This is not romantic poverty. It is real limitation. But real limitation, endured without bitterness devouring the heart, can sometimes produce an unusual clarity. A person begins to distinguish what is essential from what is merely impressive. That distinction would matter very much later. For the kind of leadership Lincoln eventually embodied was not theatrical. He could be eloquent, yes, but the eloquence was rooted in something older and deeper than performance. It came from interior discipline, from thought ripened by waiting, from language pared down until it could carry grief, responsibility, and hope all at once. If you are listening in bed, beneath blankets, in the long exhale of evening, perhaps this matters more than it first appears. Because quiet leadership is not only a political idea, it is a human one. It asks, what kind of soul do you become when no one is applauding? What do you practice in obscurity? How do you carry pain? How do you speak when words are costly? Can gentleness survive responsibility? Can humility survive power? Lincoln would spend much of his life answering those questions, not in theory, but in the grain of daily living. And daily living for now is enough. Picture him older by only a little, still far from fame, drawn toward books whenever chance allows. On the American frontier, books were precious and not always easy to obtain. Yet Lincoln developed a reputation for reading intensely, absorbing language with unusual devotion. His rise was marked not by elite schooling, but by determined self-study. A borrowed book can become a lantern. A page read slowly enough can become a path. A sentence once loved can remain in a life for decades, surfacing later when needed most. Perhaps that is why this chapter of Lincoln's life feels especially suited to the night, because nighttime belongs to inward things, to recollection, to thought, to questions too deep for daylight haste. You can imagine a fire burning low, a wall of rough wood behind him, and that unmistakable frontier stillness pressing close around the cabin. Somewhere beyond the door, the land is dark and immense, but here, within reach of one wavering light, the mind is opening, not toward comfort, but toward meaning, not toward certainty, but toward truth. And in this small scene, almost too small to notice, lies the beginning of a life that would one day steady millions. Not because the boy already knows his destiny. He does not. Not because history has selected him with trumpets. It has not. But because character is already being shaped in the dark. You may rest in that thought. Character is shaped in the dark, in sorrow no one else fully sees, in work that seems unglamorous, in self-education carried on without reward, in the refusal to become coarse in a coarse world, in the decision, repeated quietly, to remain open to truth. As the night deepens around this first part of the story, let the image soften. The cabin dims. The trees stand watch. The child remains half lit by firelight, not yet the man the world will remember, only Abraham growing in silence. And you, gentle listener, may stay beside that silence a little longer. For in the next movement of the story, the boy will begin to seek language more deliberately, and the life of the mind, once only a spark, will gather into a patient flame. Now, as the night deepens, let the story continue without haste. The cabin remains small, the woods remain vast, and the child you have been sitting beside in imagination the child of rough timber, early grief, and dim frontier light, begins to discover that there are worlds which can be entered without crossing a river, without saddling a horse, without even stepping beyond the threshold. They live in books, and perhaps you know from your own quieter hours how mysterious that can feel. A page so thin, so ordinary, and yet able to open distances greater than roads. A sentence, silent on the surface, and yet carrying voices, places, laws, ideas, histories, and lives that would otherwise remain beyond reach. For a boy growing up with little formal schooling, books were not simply an amusement. They were companions, ladders, lanterns. So picture him now, not as legend, but as presence. You are beside him in the rush after work. The body is tired. The day has already taken a lot. There is the smell of earth and wood smoke in the room. The light is weak and precious. Every page must be valued because light itself is limited. And yet he reads. He reads because something in him cannot remain satisfied with mere survival. He reads because language offers order in a world that can feel harsh and unfinished. He reads because thought gives shape to feeling. He reads because the mind, once awakened, begins asking for its own bread. There is a special tenderness in the image of an earnest young reader in a place not made for leisure. It is one of those deeply human scenes that history often rushes past on its way to larger events. But for your purposes tonight, for a slow and reverent telling, this scene matters very much. Because before Lincoln became a man of public words, he was a private listener. He listened to what sentences could do. He listened to rhythm. He listened to moral weight. He listened to the plain dignity of carefully chosen language. And since this is a sleep story, you may let that image remain soft and glowing before you. No noise, no ambition announced aloud. Only the long inward work of becoming. He gathered learning by littles. What a peaceful phrase that is. It reminds you that lives are often built that way. Not all at once. Not by one shining moment. Not by some single certainty descending from above, but by littles. A lesson here, a borrowed page there, a remembered phrase, a night of thought, a wound carried, a task completed, a principle quietly kept. That was the rhythm of Lincoln's early growth. And perhaps this is one reason his life still feels so deeply approachable. He does not begin where many powerful figures begin, already polished, already positioned, already insulated from ordinary struggle. He begins near the ground. He begins in obscurity. He begins among the unfinished things. As you rest inside this chapter, imagine the land around him changing with the seasons. Winter, bare trees, frozen ground, a stillness so deep that the world seems to be holding its breath. Spring, mud, thaw, damp timber, the slow return of birdsong and work. Summer, long heat, insects in the fields, the body called outward again into labor. Autumn, smoke in the air, low light, a sense that everything is passing even as it ripens. To grow up close to the seasons is to be taught certain truths without lecture. That effort returns again, that no condition lasts forever. That harvest follows patience, but only through labor. That loss is woven into beauty. And all of this, though quiet, becomes part of Lincoln's inward schooling. He is not merely learning facts, he is learning proportions. A great many leaders never learn this. They confuse urgency with depth, noise with conviction, speed with wisdom. But the frontier, along with hardship and grief, can teach proportion. It can teach a person how small he is before weather, how dependent he is upon others, how foolish vanity looks when measured against hunger, illness, cold, or death. From such conditions, humility sometimes emerges not as performance, but as realism. Lincoln would later speak with unusual plainness about his own origins. That plainness feels like a window into his temperament, clear-eyed, unsentimental, and free of theatrical self-invention. And so, while some lives are built on the careful presentation of importance, his was built on acquaintance with what the world calls ordinary. Ordinary labor, ordinary sorrow, ordinary people, ordinary failure, ordinary need. These would remain with him. And because they remained with him, he did not fully lose the common scale of human life, even after entering uncommon responsibility. But that is later. For now, you are still with the young Abraham, and the small miracle of literacy is becoming, in his hands, something more than a practical skill. It is becoming a doorway into self-command. Reading teaches slowness. Writing teaches order. To write even a simple sentence requires a mind to select, arrange, and restrain. It asks a person not only what he feels, but what he truly means. You can imagine him sensing this gradually. Those words, used well, do not merely decorate thought, they discipline it. Perhaps there were evenings when the room around him was restless, practical, weary, and yet he remained drawn inward, as if some private currents were moving beneath the visible day. There is often such a current in the young, who later become people of consequence, not a grand certainty of destiny, but an unmistakable inwardness. A feeling that something is being gathered, though no one yet knows for what. And because this is a bedtime narrative, you need not force that current into clarity. Let it remain mysterious. Let him remain partly unknown even to himself. That is truer, in any case. No child knows the full meaning of his own formation. No young laborer, reading by uncertain light, can clearly see the shape of the years ahead. He only knows that the mind keeps reaching, that language matters, that fairness seems important, that there is more to understand than the visible world immediately provides. And so the hidden story continues. There is something important in the physicality of those years. The future president was not raised apart from the body's demands. He knew fatigue, he knew weather, he knew repetitive labor, he knew the plain economy of effort. When a person grows through such work, certain illusions become harder to sustain. You do not easily romanticize hardship when your back has borne it. You do not easily despise common labor when your own life has depended upon it. And perhaps you do not so easily forget the dignity of ordinary people once you have lived among their needs. This, too, belongs to quiet leadership, not merely the ability to decide, but the ability to remember, remembering where life is lived, to remember what burdens it feels like when carried by tired hands. To remember that policy, law, and national language eventually settle into kitchens, fields, wagons, workshops, griefs, letters, and graves. Lincoln would eventually speak to a nation. But long before that, he had lived among those who endured life at close range. Now let the scene widen a little. The boy becomes a young man. The forests do not disappear at once, but life begins to move outward. The horizon broadens. Illinois enters the story. Even the name feels quiet tonight. Imagine a small settlement, not grand, not fixed forever, but full of movement and experiment. People arriving, building, trading, trying, failing, hoping. In such a place, a young man could be seen more clearly than in the deeper isolation of childhood. Humor would matter. Reliability would matter. Reputation would matter. So would the ability to speak plainly, to listen, to make oneself useful. And Lincoln, by many accounts, possessed something memorable in his manner. Not polished elegance, not aristocratic confidence, something more human, a lanky presence, a plain face that could turn unexpectedly luminous with wit or sadness, a seriousness softened by humor, an awkward exterior carrying inward depth. It is often that way with the most quietly influential people. Their first impression may not dazzle, their deep impression endures. As you rest within this slow unfolding, consider how the outer and inner life begin to meet. Work gives him contact with many kinds of people. Reading gives him language. Loss gives him tenderness. Obscurity gives him patience. And little by little, a character form that is capable of both sympathy and steadiness. This is a rare combination. Some become tender but indecisive. Some become strong but hard. Some become clever but shallow. Some become ambitious but inwardly hollow. Lincoln's long formation seems to have moved toward another possibility: gentleness without weakness, gravity without coldness, ambition without complete vanity, sorrow without surrender. Not perfectly, of course. No human being arrives in perfection, but enough that others would begin to trust him. And trust, unlike fame, grows slowly. It cannot be shouted into existence. It gathers through consistency, through witnessed conduct, through the quiet evidence that a person can bear responsibility without becoming false. Now the chapter begins to turn. For reading alone is not enough. Thought begins eventually to ask for use. Conscience begins to ask for form. A mind shaped in silence starts to move towards speech, argument, and judgment. Lincoln would go on to study law and enter public life in Illinois, carrying with him the marks of his self-fashioned education and frontier experience. And that is where the next movement of the story will lead. Toward courtrooms and roads, toward listening and reasoning, toward the discipline of law. toward the discovery that words can do more than comfort or instruct. They can persuade, protect, and bind a people to principles larger than themselves. But before you move on, rest once more in the stillness of this middle passage. A borrowed book, a low fire, a settlement at dusk, a young man growing not by leaps but by layers. This is how character deepens, not in a single declaration, but in repeated contact with difficulty. Not in the performance of wisdom, but in the patient love of truth. Not in escaping ordinary life, but in meeting it fully enough that compassion survives. And somewhere within that slow deepening, Abraham Lincoln is becoming the kind of man who can one day hold terrible responsibility without entirely losing tenderness. The night around him remains gentle. The lamp burns low. The page turns, and the life continues to gather itself. What was once inward hunger began to search more consciously for direction. The young man who loved words has also learned the feel of labor, the roughness of common life, the complexity of human nature. He is not formed by books alone, nor by hardship alone, but by the slow meeting of both. This is how character is made, not in one realm only, but where thought and life keep pressing against each other until something durable appears. Imagine him now in early adulthood, moving through the ordinary demands of work, conversation, responsibility, and uncertainty. He is still not the man history will remember, and yet more people notice that there is something unusual in him. Not polish, not beauty, not the sleek confidence that rises easily in men who have always been reassured of their place. Something better, earn depth. He can laugh, he can tell a story, he can do the plain work in front of him. But behind these qualities, there is a weight in him, a gravity that does not feel rehearsed. Perhaps this is because his life has already taught him what cannot be faked, that sorrow is real, that effort matters, that language has consequences, that human beings deserve more than contempt. How peaceful it is to follow such a life at night, because it does not insist upon spectacle. It grows by acquaintance with reality. A young man in a village or settlement may seem, from far away, ordinary, but if you watch closely, ordinary life is where most souls reveal themselves. How does he speak to people weaker than himself? How does he respond to inconvenience? Does humor in him become cruelty or warmth? Does disappointment shrink him or deepen him? These questions are small in appearance, large in consequence. Lincoln's life offers no evidence of easy perfection. He struggled, changed, failed at times, and carried inward shadows. Yet he kept becoming. That may be one of the most comforting features of his story. He was not born fully formed. He became more truthful through time. Now let the rhythm of his days rise before you. Mornings of work, hours of reading when possible, encounters with strangers and acquaintances, the testing of mind against circumstance, the repeated necessity of beginning again. Lives are not made from grand events alone. They are made from repetition, and repetition, when joined to sincerity, becomes formation. You can almost feel him learning to stand within himself more firmly, not proudly in the cheap sense, not inflated, simply steadier, more able to discern who he is and what he values, more willing to let words carry thought instead of hiding it, more willing to let seriousness and humor live side by side. And because character is never only private, this deepening begins to affect others. People listen. They notice fairness. They notice without meanness. They notice reliability. They notice a mind that does not dart about seeking easy advantage. Such notice is the beginning of trust. And trust, once again, is the foundation of quiet leadership. Not popularity, not glamour, trust. The kind that comes when people begin to believe that a person's inner life and outer conduct are in harmony. By this time, Lincoln has also been tested by the untidiness of becoming. There are ambitions, yes, but ambitions meeting delay. There are possibilities opening, yet not cleanly. There is no smooth path. The future remains uncertain enough to require patience. This is a hidden blessing in many lives. Immediate success often flatters a person before he is ready. Delay can do another kind of work. It can strip away fantasy. It can teach whether one loves the work itself or only the admiration attached to it. It can expose vanity. It can strengthen persistence. Lincoln had much to learn in the school of delay. And delay did not waste him. It seasoned him. So if you are listening tonight with your own unfinished hopes, your own slower seasons, perhaps his story carries a quiet reassurance. That delay is not always denial. That obscurity may still be fertile. that what ripens slowly may endure more deeply than what blooms overnight. Now the chapter begins to lean toward vocation. Life of the mind, long cultivated in fragments, is no longer content only to absorb. It begins to seek shape in law, public reasoning, judgment, responsibility. Thought wants form, character wants work worthy of it. And that movement, as gentle as dawn, leads him toward the legal world. But before the story goes there fully, pause one more time in this place of slow making. This is Lincoln not yet at center stage. Lincoln before the nation. Lincoln, while still becoming visible to only a few at a time. Lincoln is under the patient hand of daily life. You can feel the whole future hidden inside these ordinary years. Not visibly, not dramatically, but really, the embers are gathering, and soon they will begin to give off a steadier light. Now let the road lengthen gently before you. The years of childhood have not disappeared, but they have settled into him, like wood smoke into old cloth, like weather into timber, like memory into the grain of the heart. The boy who read by dim light, who knew early labor and early loss, has become a young man moving outward into the world. And yet the inward life remains. It travels with him. It deepens as he goes. You can imagine the morning light over Illinois, pale at first, resting softly on fields, fences, and the simple outlines of a growing settlement. The air is cool. The earth is still holding the hush of dawn. Somewhere a cart creaks into motion. Somewhere else, a door opens and the day begins again with ordinary needs. And into such mornings, Abraham Lincoln walks. Not yet the figure of statues, not yet the guardian of a nation, only a man in the slow middle of becoming, carrying awkward grace, thoughtful silence, and a mind that has learned already to search beneath appearances. New Salem lies before him now in your imagination, a small frontier village, with all the uncertainty and energy of a place not long established. There are stores, paths worn into the ground, human voices rising and falling with barter, weather, hope, fatigue. It is not grand. It does not try to be grand. It is made of effort, of people trying to build a life from rough materials and uncertain prospects. This is a fitting place for Lincoln. For New Salem, like the frontier itself, does not reward polish as much as usefulness. A person must be steady. A person must be known. A person must learn how to stand among others, not through display, but through trust. And trust, as you know, grows slowly. It is not made in speeches first. It is made in conduct, in how one answers when spoken to, in whether one can be counted upon, in whether one laughs kindly or cruelly, in whether one listens, in whether one keeps faith with what is small before reaching toward what is large. So imagine him there. Tall, plain, memorable in a way that is difficult to explain. His face is not conventionally handsome. His clothing is not aristocratic. His manners are not those of a finished gentleman from an old and settled world. And yet people notice him, not because he shines with vanity, but because something about him feels uncommon in a quieter way. He seems present. He seems alert. He seems to contain more than he says. And sometimes that is the beginning of influence. In the village store, in conversation, in errands and exchanges, he learns something essential about human beings. Not as abstractions, not as ideas in a book, but as neighbors, customers, workers, widows, farmers, tradesmen, wanderers, hopeful men, disappointed men, people with stories they tell too quickly, and sorrows they do not mention at all. This, too, becomes part of his education. Not schoolroom learning, but human learning. A leader who only studies policy may learn systems. A leader who listens deeply begins to learn souls. Lincoln's gift, even before it had fully ripened, seems to have included this patient attention to the texture of other lives. He did not merely want to speak, he wanted to understand. And perhaps because he had not been handed an easy path, he did not assume that people were simple. He knew effort, he knew embarrassment. He knew aspiration mixed with uncertainty. He knew that humor could hide pain. He knew that roughness did not always mean emptiness. These are quiet forms of wisdom. At night, when the village settles and the sound of the day grows thin, you may picture him returning to books, to thought, to the slow shaping of language. But now there is something new. Reading is no longer only inward nourishment. It is becoming preparation. Preparation for judgment. Preparation for responsibility. Preparation for the difficult art of speaking clearly in a confused world. You can almost feel the transition happening beneath the surface. The inward life is searching for form, and one of the forms it will find is law. There is something fitting, almost inevitable, in Lincoln's movement toward the law. Law at its best is not only argument, it is disciplined listening. It asks what happened, what is fair, what can be proved, what words mean, what obligations bind one life to another. For a mind like his, patient, verbal, morally alert, and trained by scarcity to value clarity, the law would offer both challenge and structure. So let the scene shift softly. The village recedes a little. The horizon broadens. The young man who once gathered knowledge by littles now gathers it with firmer intent. He studies, he labors over principles and phrasing. He begins to move not just through life, but toward a vocation. And because this is a sleep story, you need not imagine this as triumph in a sudden blaze. It is quieter than that, more like a lamp being turned up, more like the steady adding of one log after another to a low burning fire. He is still self-made in the old, difficult sense, not inventing himself from nothing, but shaping himself through discipline. You may picture long hours of reading, not in luxury, but in necessity. The law is not a decorative accomplishment for him. It is a path, a structure, a way of entering public usefulness without surrendering seriousness. And what does he bring into that path? A frontier boy's realism, a laborer's acquaintance with effort, a reader's love of language, a mourner's tenderness, a thinker's patience. All of it matters. In time, he begins riding the legal circuit in Illinois, traveling from county to county, appearing in courtrooms that are less theatrical than intimate, less glamorous than human. And here, perhaps more than anywhere else in his early adulthood, you can see the quiet leader taking shape. Imagine the roads, long roads, dusty in dry weather, heavy in rain, roads lined with fields, groves, creeks, and the changing sky. Roads that give a man time to think. He rides not toward ceremony, but toward cases, toward disagreements over land, debts, contracts, injuries, misunderstandings, the practical knots of ordinary life. The people he encounters are not symbols. They are souls with fears, temperaments, habits, loyalty, injuries, and prides. To serve them well, a lawyer must do more than speak. He must listen long enough to hear what is being said, and sometimes what is not being said. You can imagine Lincoln in a courthouse made of simple materials. Sunlight falling through high windows, dust suspended in the air, chairs creaking, papers shifting, voices rising and then settling. There is no myth here, only work. The steady work of sorting confusion, the careful work of language meeting reality. And Lincoln, who had learned early to observe, seems to have possessed a gift for making people feel both understood and measured. He could be humorous, even disarmingly so. But beneath the humor was attentiveness. He did not rush too quickly to the center of a room simply to prove he belonged there. He could wait. He could watch. He could let truth emerge. There is power in that kind of waiting. Not the passivity of indifference, but the restraint of a mind confident enough not to force itself forward before understanding ripens. As you listen now, resting perhaps in darkness, you may recognize how rare such a quality is. Many people wish to be heard. Far fewer know how to hear. Yet history turns again on the character of those who can listen beneath noise, who can detect what is essential beneath what is merely loud. Lincoln's law years taught him this again. Every client enters with a version of events. Every dispute arrives clothed in certainty. Every human being is tempted at times to tell the story in a way that protects the self. To practice law well is to move through these laws without cruelty, but also without illusion. He grows skilled in that work, not because he becomes cold, but because he becomes exact. And exactness, when joined to mercy, becomes a kind of moral grace. You may imagine him in conversation after court, walking with colleagues at evening, or sitting in simple lodging, his long frame folded awkwardly into a chair, sharing stories, reflections, perhaps a well-timed bit of humor. For Lincoln's humor matters. It is not separate from his seriousness, it helps carry it. Some people use humor to escape gravity. He seems often to have used it to survive gravity without hardening. That, too, is a leadership lesson hidden in the quieter folds of his life. A heart under strain must sometimes laugh, not because the world is light, but because without laughter, the burden might become too heavy to bear. And still, even as he moves more fully into public and professional life, something solitary remains in him. You can feel it like a low note beneath the brighter movements of the story. He is among people, but not dissolved by the crowd. He belongs in the world, yet also stands slightly apart from it, as if part of him is always observing, always gathering, always testing words against conscience. This inward reserve gives depth to his public manner. He does not persuade by glitter. He persuades by weight, by honesty, by the impression that he has paid for his thoughts before speaking them aloud. Such people are seldom the quickest to dazzle, but they are often the ones remembered longest. As the circuit years continue, you may sense how law becomes for Lincoln a school of democracy in its most practical form. Not democracy as slogan, but democracy as daily human friction, people living together imperfectly, binding themselves by rules, relying on words, precedents, duties, and promises, because life together would otherwise dissolve into grievance and force. This would matter so much later, for a man who spends years working among arguments, trying to reconcile principle with circumstance, learns habits that can steady him when the arguments become national. He learns that passion alone cannot guide judgment. He learns that language must be both precise and humane. He learns that fairness is not softness and firmness is not anger. By now, in the gentle onward movement of the story, you can see more clearly what quiet leadership means in Lincoln's life. It means becoming trustworthy before becoming celebrated. It means learning about people before trying to move them. It means speaking from earned thought instead of borrowed performance. It means taking the common life seriously enough that when larger responsibility comes, one is not dazzled by scale. And perhaps most of all, it means listening so long and so well that when the time finally comes to speak, the words carry the weight of many lives, one's own. This chapter, then, is not merely about profession. It is about training through attention. The road, the courtroom, the village, the conversation after dusk, the book reopened by lamplight. All of it is shaping him into a man whose authority will one day rest not only on office, but on moral credibility. The night around you feel calm now. You have followed him from the woods into the roads of Illinois, from raw struggle into disciplined usefulness, from inward hunger into public preparation. And still he is becoming, still unfinished, still gathering, still learning the difficult gentleness of measured power. So let this chapter close the way such chapters should, not with a trumpet, but with a lamp. A lamp in a modest room, papers near at hand, boots set aside after travel, the day's voice is fading, the long-minded lawyer sitting in thought before sleep. He has listened to others all day. Now he listens once more, inwardly, to conscience, to memory, to the shaping of his own soul. And in that quiet, the future waits, patient and unseen. Now, let the road grow quieter. You have traveled with him through the villages and courtrooms, through long Illinois miles, through arguments made orderly by law, through the steady shaping of a man who learned how to listen before he learned how to lead. And yet, even a life that appears outwardly to be gathering strength is never made of public effort alone. There are inner rooms now to enter, softer rooms, more shadowed rooms, rooms where love and loneliness sit closer together than the world can easily see. For Abraham Lincoln, as for so many deep-feeling souls, the life of the mind was never entirely separate from the life of the heart. He could reason carefully, yes. He could laugh, tell stories, soften a room with wit. He could stand in public and shape words with unusual force. But beneath these gifts, there was also an inward heaviness, a gravity not fully explained by circumstance alone. Some temperaments carry light easily, others carry depth, and depth, though beautiful, often comes with weight. So let the scenes soften around you. It is evening again, perhaps in Springfield now, where life has grown a little more settled, a little more defined, though never entirely simple. The legal years continue. Reputation grows. Responsibilities gather. There are dinners, visits, conversations, professional duties, political undercurrents beginning to stir more clearly in the background. And within this growing life, another thread enters: love. Not love as fairy tale, not love untouched by difficulty, but love as encounter, as recognition, as complication, as the meeting of two strong inner worlds. Mary Todd enters the story with brightness, intelligence, social confidence, and emotional force. In temperament, she and Lincoln are not the same. Perhaps that is part of why their bond has always seemed both fascinating and tenderly human. They are not a pair cast in easy harmony. They are more complex than that. Two vivid lives, two different sensibilities, two people carrying their own histories, hopes, fragilities, and ambitions into the uncertain shelter of shared life. Imagine them not as symbols, but as people. A conversation in lamplight, a room full of others, yet some current of attention moving quietly between them. A mind recognizing another mind. A loneliness, perhaps, sensing the possibility of companionship. Love does not always arrive as peace. Sometimes it arrives first as intensity, as disruption, as the startling realization that one is no longer entirely self-contained. And Lincoln, who had spent so much of his earlier life in inwardness and striving, now finds himself drawn into the emotional nearness of another person's presence. You can imagine how strange and powerful that must have felt. For a man accustomed to long solitude of thought, intimacy is not a small event. To be known more closely, to be answered, challenged, seen, this can be both consoling and unsettling. The heart does not open without risk, especially not a heart already acquainted with sorrow. And Lincoln's heart, by this point in the story, has already learned enough of sorrow to know that love and vulnerability walk together. So this chapter must move gently, not because it is empty of pain, but because pain, when spoken softly, becomes more human and less harsh. There were periods in Lincoln's life when sadness seems to have pressed deeply upon him. Melancholy, that old and quiet word, follows him through many recollections of his adulthood. It is not the passing sadness of a bad day. It is something deeper, more atmospheric, a certain inward weather that returns, a seriousness of feeling, a susceptibility to shadows, a temperament that seems at times to stand very near the edges of grief, even when life outwardly continues. And yet, this melancholy is not the whole story. It does not erase his humor. It does not erase his affection. It does not erase his capacity to work, to care, to reason, to endure. Instead, it gives his life a different kind of texture. It makes his kindness feel costlier. It makes his laughter feel more tender. It makes his patience feel less automatic and more earned. This is important for understanding the kind of leader he would become later. Some people are calm because they have never stood near the abyss. Others are calm because they have learned, somehow, to live beside it without surrendering their humanity. Lincoln belongs more to the second kind. So when you picture him with Mary, do not picture only courtship or domestic scenes smoothed into sentiment. Picture also the mystery of two people trying to build a life while carrying the unfinished burdens of themselves. There is affection, yes. There is admiration. There is wit. There is strain. There is nearness. There is misunderstanding. There is shared hope. There is also the ordinary difficulty of being human under one roof while the world presses in from outside. And still, there is tenderness. A home, even when imperfect, can become a place where a person's public self loosens, where fatigue appears plainly, where silence means more, where sorrow can no longer be disguised quite so easily behind story or argument. In such spaces, Lincoln is not merely the rising lawyer or the careful speaker. He is husband, later father, a man whose life is bound to the fate of others not by rhetoric, but by love. The thought of Lincoln as a father adds another softness to the story. Children alter the atmosphere of a life. Even in houses touched by worry, they bring motion, unpredictability, small joys, interruptions to self-importance. A child's presence pulls a person back toward the immediate, toward laughter, concern, play, protection, sleeplessness, wonder. And for a man of deep interiority, children can become a kind of earthly tether, a reminder that life is not only made of abstract principles and large historical currents, but of rooms, faces, fevers, footsteps, and voices calling from the next space over. Imagine him then, not beneath the gaze of history, but beneath the softer lamp of home. A long day behind him, papers still waiting, political questions somewhere beyond the walls. And yet before him, a child in motion, a household breathing, the fragile and ordinary sacredness of family life. How often history forgets this. It remembers the speech and forgets the room from which the speaker rose. It remembers the decision and forgets the heart that had already been shaped by smaller loves and smaller griefs. But you are not rushing. Not tonight. Tonight you linger where a human being becomes more deeply human. And with love comes fear, because once the heart has attached itself, loss becomes imaginable again. Lincoln knew this in ways that would deepen with time. Family life brought joy, but also vulnerability, and sorrow would visit him more than once. These losses did not make him less gentle. If anything, they seemed to have widened the chamber of compassion within him. Pain did not always simplify him. Sometimes it made him more spacious. There is a quiet holiness in that. Not pain itself is never holy simply because it hurts, but the refusal to let pain make the soul smaller. Lincoln's melancholy, his tenderness, his capacity for deep attachment, all of these belong together. They are not separate strands, but one woven fabric. And when you understand that the public man begins to look different, his patience is no longer only a political skill. It is also emotional discipline. His mercy is not only moral philosophy, it is something shaped by grief. His reluctance to indulge cruelty is not weakness. It is the wisdom of someone who knows how much suffering already exists in the world. Perhaps this is why his presence, even in silence, could feel so substantial. He had suffered enough to take suffering seriously. He had loved enough to understand what can be broken. He had felt enough inward darkness not to mistake cheerful shallowness for strength. As the chapter deepens, imagine him walking alone after an evening of company has ended. The streets are quieter now. The stars are visible above Springfield. The house behind him holds its own mixture of comfort and strain. The future is not yet clear. Ambition exists, yes, but so do doubt and inward heaviness. He walks slowly, not merely to arrive, but because the mind is still turning. What does it mean to live well? What does duty ask? How does one carry sadness without yielding to it? How does one love imperfectly and still love faithfully? How does one remain soft in the heart and steady in the will? These questions are not spoken aloud in simple form. They are living, and Lincoln lives them quietly. The listener resting now in darkness may find something deeply comforting here. Not because the chapter is light. It is not, but because it is honest in a gentle way. It reminds you that great souls are not always cheerful souls. Some of the kindest people are those who have had to learn hope very slowly. Some of the most compassionate are those who have walked long beside sadness without allowing it to turn them bitter. So if Lincoln's life carries melancholy, it also carries a strange and beautiful resilience. He remains engaged. He continues his work. He offers affection. He tells stories. He returns to duty. He keeps going, not with the brightness of someone untouched by sorrow, but with the quiet endurance of someone who knows that sorrow must be carried and chooses to carry it without ceasing to care. Now let the room grow still again. Mary is part of the story. The children are part of the story. The private ache is part of the story. The tenderness is part of the story. And all of it is preparing him, though he cannot yet fully know for what. For the public voice that will later move a nation is being shaped, even now, in the intimate chambers of love and grief. A man who has been changed by tenderness speaks differently from a man who seeks only victory. A man who has sat beside sorrow chooses words differently from a man who has never been broken open by life. Lincoln is becoming such a man, not finished, not serene in any simple sense, but deepening. His heart, though burdened, remains alive. And that aliveness, that capacity to feel without collapsing, to endure without hardening, will become one of the most important quiet powers of his life. So let this chapter close in a hush. A house at night, a lamp low on the table, a husband and father moving through the fragile duties of love. A thoughtful man carrying both melancholy and tenderness in the same soul. Outside, history is beginning to stir more loudly. Inside, the heart is still being formed. And when you are ready, the next chapter will follow that formation into a widening public world, where Lincoln's voice, patient, moral, and unmistakably his own, will begin to rise more clearly above the age. Now let the horizon widen. You have walked beside him through the inward years, through wood smoke and winter ground, through borrowed books, law books, sorrow, laughter, and the tender, difficult chambers of love. You have seen how his life has been formed not by ease, but by patience, not by spectacle, but by long discipline of mind and heart. And now, almost without your noticing the exact moment of change, the private man begins to stand more fully in public view. Not suddenly, not with dazzling confidence, not with the polished ease of one born to command a stage, but slowly, as though the years themselves had been preparing a voice, and that voice, having ripened in obscurity, could no longer remain entirely hidden. So let the scene open onto Illinois again. The prairie stretches outward beneath a broad sky. Towns gather people in modest clusters. Roads carry wagons, horses, rumors, newspapers, arguments. Evening meetings are held in halls, churches, courthouses, open grounds. Men arrive in boots dusty from travel. Women listen carefully. Young people watch with the alertness of those who sense that history may be moving nearby, even if it has not yet taken its final shape. The nation is changing. You can feel it now as a low tension beneath daily life. Questions once discussed at a distance begin to draw nearer. The expansion of slavery, the balance of states, the meaning of union, the moral direction of the republic. These are no longer abstractions resting quietly in books or in the chambers of far-off government. They are entering conversation, conscience, election, identity. They are becoming part of the weather of the age. And into that weather, Abraham Lincoln rises, not as a thunderclap, but as a steadying tone. This is important. For many people, imagine public greatness as something loud from the beginning. They imagine the forceful entrance, the irresistible charisma, the immediate certainty of destiny. But Lincoln's public power feels different. It seems to gather in layers, much as his whole life has gathered. Thought first, language next, conviction slowly clarified, then speech when speech becomes necessary. His voice rises the way dawn rises over a field, almost quietly at first, then undeniably. You can picture him before an audience now. He is tall, angular, a little awkward in form, not luxurious in dress, not adorned by any ornamental polish. Yet once he begins to speak, something changes in the room. People lean in. The outer plainness remains, but it is joined by inward force. There is sincerity in him. There is structure. There is humor, yes, but also moral gravity. He speaks as one who has earned his words through long thought rather than borrowed them from fashion. And those who listen begin to feel it. This man means what he says. That feeling cannot be manufactured. It comes only when language and character have grown near each other, when speech sounds like an extension of the soul rather than a performance laid over it. As the years move forward, politics draws him more strongly into view. The great national arguments sharpen. The old political arrangements are strained. New alignments form. The issue of slavery's expansion presses with increasing urgency upon the conscience of the country. Lincoln does not enter this moment carelessly. He is not a man intoxicated by argument for its own sake. He does not seem to love conflict, because it is conflict. Rather, he is drawn to the point where law, morality, and national purpose begin to meet, and where silence itself becomes a kind of surrender. This is one of the quiet turning points in the life of any thoughtful person. There comes a time when inward conviction can no longer remain only inward, a time when reflection must become utterance, when moral unease must become moral speech, when one must stand and say gently perhaps, but clearly, this matters. So imagine the deepening seriousness of those years. The crowd assembled, the air closed in a meeting hall. The murmur before the address begins. The scrape of chairs, a hand resting on folded notes, a tall figure rising into view. And then the voice, not rushed, not theatrical, measured, plain, penetrating. Lincoln had the rare gift of speaking in ways that seemed both thoughtful and accessible. He could reason with precision without losing the common listener. He could elevate without becoming abstract. He could touch moral nerves without turning every sentence into ornament. His style, even when powerful, was often grounded in clarity. This suited the man he had become. A frontier child does not easily trust unnecessary decoration. A self-educated mind learns to value what holds. A lawyer learns what words can bear in public. And all these currents now begin to join in him. As you listen tonight, perhaps drifting more deeply into rest, you may imagine one of those Illinois evenings when the western light lingers long and the crowd waits in that peculiar stillness before something important is said. Lincoln stands not as a finished icon, but as a man who has suffered, worked, read, loved, failed, persisted. He stands carrying all the earlier chapters within him. That is why the voice matters. It is not merely sound. It is biography made audible. And what does the voice say? It says that the nation cannot drift forever in moral vagueness. It says that words like freedom and union must mean something durable. It says that law cannot be wholly separated from conscience. It says that public life, if it is to remain honorable, must eventually answer to truths deeper than convenience. Such a voice does not always soothe the age it enters. Sometimes it unsettles, but there is a difference between agitation and awakening. Lincoln's best public speech seems to awaken more than it agitates. It asks listeners to think more seriously, to weigh more carefully, to rise, not into frenzy, but into responsibility. This quality became especially visible in his debates with Stephen Douglas. Now the story broadens further. Imagine the debate grounds. Town after town, the nation watching more closely than before. Newspapers carrying the words outward, crowds gathering under open sky, the two men distinct in style, in posture, and political temperament, Douglas more established, more seasoned in national prominence. Lincoln less outwardly commanding in appearance, yet increasingly unforgettable in substance. And here, too, the quiet years bear fruit. For public debate is not only about verbal speed. It is about balance, self-command, moral clarity, the capacity to hold a line without collapsing into anger or vanity. Lincoln had been preparing for such a moment long before he knew it. Every hard road, every legal argument, every inward struggle with sadness, every effort to say things plainly, all had trained him for speech under pressure. You can almost hear it now. The crowd shifts, a breeze crosses the grounds, a hat is removed, a hand shades the eyes from afternoon brightness. And Lincoln begins. He does not seem to speak from ego alone. He speaks from accumulated conviction. That makes all the difference. Some speakers try to conquer the room. Some try to impress it. Some try to dominate it. Lincoln, at his best, seems to try to persuade conscience. That is a quieter ambition, and a more enduring one. He was not free of political ambition, of course. No serious public life is untouched by ambition. But in him, ambition appears braided with something weightier, the sense that the nation's course mattered morally, and that public speech must help clarify rather than merely inflame. This is why his voice rose slowly, because it was not assembled for display. It was formed for use. It took time to mature because it was being shaped by reality, by labor, law, grief, responsibility, and reflection. It had to become honest before it became famous. And once people heard that honesty, many could not forget it. Even those who disagreed with him often sensed substances. Even those who opposed his conclusions could hear that he was not playing lightly with language. The words were rooted. They carried moral pressure, because they had first passed through the furnace of his own thought. As the debates and speeches widened his reputation, the country began to see in him something more than a regional lawyer or a capable politician. It began to see a national figure, not yet victorious, not yet secure, but visible now in a new way. And visibility is its own burden. For once a voice is heard widely, it no longer belongs only to private intention. It enters newspaper columns, public interpretation, admiration, criticism, distortion, hope. It begins to carry the projections of thousands. A lesser man may become inflated by this. Another may become defensive. Lincoln seems instead to have remained tethered to his inward seriousness. That tether would matter greatly later, for praise is not always safe for the soul. Neither is opposition. A person who wishes to lead quietly must learn how to stand in both without being entirely remade by either. Lincoln was learning this now. You may picture him after one of the debates, the crowd dispersing, twilight settling over the grounds, voices replaying fragments of what was said. Perhaps he returns to his lodging tired, but still inwardly alert, the mind still moving over phrases, the heart still measuring the stakes of the hour. He knows, perhaps more clearly than before, that the nation is entering dangerous terrain. He knows that words will matter. He knows, too, that words alone are never enough. Still, in a republic, speech is one of the sacred instruments by which moral direction is tested and revealed. To speak responsibly is to serve. To speak truthfully under pressure is a form of courage. To keep language joined to conscience in a time of division is one of the highest tasks public life can ask. Lincoln is drawing nearer to that task. So this chapter is not simply the story of a man becoming known. It is the story of a voice becoming equal to its time. A voice shaped in silence, a voice tested in law, a voice softened by sorrow, a voice disciplined by thought, a voice now rising carefully and unmistakably into history. And because this is still a sleep story, the chapter closes not in applause, but in the quiet evening. The debate field empties. The sky dims into lavender and deep blue. The roads home lengthen under the first stars. And Lincoln, still not knowing all that lies ahead, carries his thoughts into the night. He spoke. The nation has heard something in that speech. Not everything yet, but enough. Enough to sense that a larger chapter is approaching. Enough to feel that the quiet man may soon be asked to bear a louder age. Enough to understand that the slow-rising voice has become one the country can no longer easily ignore. And when you are ready, the story will pass from emergence into crisis. The years of preparation will begin to meet the storm. Now let the air change. Until this point, the story has moved through candlelight, fields, roads, and rooms, through books, grief, family, law, and the slow rising of a voice. Even when the world widened around Lincoln, it did so gradually, like morning light spreading over prairie land. But now, another kind of weather begins to gather. You can feel it before you fully see it. A tension in the distance, a heaviness in conversation, a quickening in newspapers and railway stations and crowded halls. A sense, almost physical, that the nation is drawing towards something it does not know how to avoid. And during this gathering storm, the man you have been following in quiet stages is called at last toward the highest office in the land. Not because he was the loudest, not because he was the most adorner, not because he looked at first glance like the obvious choice to a restless age, but because something in him had ripened, something steady, disciplined, and grave. Something equal, perhaps, not to comfort, but to trial. So let the scene widen across the country. The year is turning. The election approaches. The old national arguments have become sharper than before. The question of slavery's expansion has grown too large to be hidden beneath temporary arrangements. The language of compromise is still spoken, but its music is thinner now, strained by fear and distrust. And Lincoln stands before the people, not as a man promising ease, but as one who has come to represent, for many, a line that must not be abandoned. You may imagine the feeling of those days. Crowds gathering beneath banners, voices reading election returns by lamplight, men waiting in anxious knots outside newspaper offices, women listening from parlors, kitchens, and boarding houses. The hush before great uncertainty becomes fact. And then the news. Abraham Lincoln has been elected President of the United States. How strange that sentence must have sounded when first it entered the air. A frontier child, a self-educated lawyer, a man once little known beyond Illinois, now chosen to carry the burden of a vast and divided republic. But election, in this case, did not bring calm. It brought rupture, for even before he took office, the fabric of the Union began to tear more visibly. Southern states, fearing the direction of the nation, and unwilling to accept the limits they believed his leadership represented, began to secede. One after another, they moved away from the Union, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in a grave procession of political separation. And now, for the first time in this story, you feel Lincoln standing not merely before difficulty, but before fracture. This is the true beginning of the storm. You may picture him in those in-between months, elected, but not yet inaugurated. The country changes beneath his feet, while he still waits to assume the office that will ask everything of him. There is something almost haunting in such a season. Responsibility is coming nearer, yet the authority to act is not fully his. The danger grows, and with it the silence around his next steps becomes even more important. What does a quiet leader do when the world begins to break before he has even taken his seat? He does what he has done all his life. He thinks carefully. He measures words. He watches the moral shape of events. He prepares inwardly. You can imagine him at a desk in winter light, letters arriving, warnings, appeals, speculations, fears, maps, newspapers, private counsels, public expectations. The atmosphere around him has changed entirely. No longer is he only the rising statesman. He is now the vessel into which a nation is pouring its anxiety. And still, within that pressure, he remains recognizable himself. That matters. Some people become louder when danger approaches. Some become theatrical. Some grow intoxicated by crisis. Some begin to mistake harshness for strength. Lincoln's temperament moved differently. He could be firm without thunder. He could be solemn without display. He could absorb terrible pressure without immediately surrendering to panic in language. This does not mean he felt no fear. Courage is often the art of carrying tremor without letting it govern the hand. For the office awaiting him is not ceremonial. It is a threshold between peace and something darker. The Union is not merely troubled. It is in peril. The idea of the United States as one enduring nation, is being tested in the most severe way it has yet known. And Lincoln knows it. Imagine the journey to Washington, not as a triumphant procession alone, though there is ceremony. Imagine it also as an approach toward loneliness. The farther he travels, the more the old life recedes. Springfield, familiar rooms, the practiced rhythms of law, the human scale of local politics. Ahead lies the capital, and beyond the capital, judgment, expectation, history. There is sadness in departure. A man leaving the known often carries more than luggage. He carries the invisible weight of all that cannot come with him unchanged. Home becomes memory even before it is fully gone. The streets once walked casually are now seen with a sharper tenderness. Friends are no longer simply companions, but witnesses to a chapter ending. And so Lincoln leaves not only a place, but an entire former scale of life. You may picture the winter sky over the station, the gathered faces, the thick cold in the air, the emotional hush that accompanies a farewell no one can fully measure. Then the train moves on, through towns, through fields, through a nation, watching him approach the office that will define him. And while the public sees a president-elect, you, because you have followed him from the beginning, still see the older layers within him. The child of hardship, the reader by firelight, the lawyer who listened, the husband and father acquainted with tenderness and sorrow. All of that enters Washington with him. None of it is lost. This is what makes the story so moving. The greatness ahead will not cancel humanity behind it. It will reveal it. When at last he arrives in the capital, the atmosphere is tense, uncertain, full of rumor and vigilance. The city itself seems to exist between ceremony and danger. Politics gather there in concentrated form: ambitions, fears, calculation, patriotism, suspicion, loyalty, ideology, hope. Yet Lincoln, who had come from wider horizons and rougher beginnings, brings something different into that atmosphere. Not elegance of polish, but the plain authority of a life shaped far from ornament. Now the inaugural day approaches. There are days in history that feel, even from a distance, like holding breath. This is one of them. A new president stands before a divided nation. The government he is about to lead is already wounded. The union he has sworn to preserve is being openly challenged. The future is unsettled in ways few can fully comprehend. And in such a moment, speech becomes more than language. It becomes a moral offering. It becomes a form of restraint, a form of warning, a form of appeal, a final bridge extended over deepening water. You can imagine the scene with soft gravity, not as noise, but as concentration. Crowds gathered, officials solemn, the air cool, the sky pale. The new president, rising to speak with the knowledge that every phrase may matter beyond ordinary measure. And what kind of voice emerges? Still his own, not shrill, not reckless, not eager for enmity. Rather, he speaks from oath and duty. He insists upon preserving the Union. He refuses the legality of secession. Yet even here, with the country edging toward war, there remains in him a notable reluctance to inflame for the sake of performance. He does not abandon firmness, but he tries, still, to leave room for return. This is one of the most moving qualities in Lincoln's leadership. Even when compelled toward resolve, he continued to seek language that did not surrender the possibility of human reconciliation. Not softness at the expense of principle, not principle emptied of mercy, but both held together as long as possible. That balance is costly. It asks a person to withstand attack from opposite sides, too lenient for some, too firm for others, too measured for the impatience, too morally awake for the cynical. A quieter leader often suffers this fate because such a leader disappoints those who want simpler passions. But Lincoln had long been apprenticed to complexity. He knew life was rarely pure in its outward form. He knew that duty and sorrow often arrive together. He knew that to govern human beings was not to arrange symbols neatly on a table, but to carry living contradictions toward whatever truth and justice could still be preserved. And then comes the attack on Fort Sumter, and with it, the final fading of certain illusions. The crisis is no longer only constitutional. It is military. The nation has crossed a threshold from which there can be no easy retreat. War begins. Even in a sleep story, you can feel the depth of that change. The air itself seems altered. Letters are written in trembling hands. Families wait. Church bells sound differently. Newspaper ink seems darker on the page. Maps are looked at not with curiosity, but with dread. And Lincoln, quiet Lincoln, must now become wartime Lincoln. Do not rush past how immense that change is. He had sought to preserve the Union. Now he must preserve it amid bloodshed. He had hoped in language to hold open the path of return. Now he must lead a government through armed rebellion. The burden shifts from argument to command, from speech to action, from persuasion to the terrible responsibilities of national survival. Yet even here, the old traits do not vanish. He still thinks before speaking. He still listens. He still measures. He still feels. In fact, the storm reveals how necessary those quiet traits have been all along. A noisy man might have seemed impressive in peace and disastrous in crisis. A vain man might have mistaken the theater of war for mastery. A shallow man might have spoken boldly and broken inwardly. Lincoln, shaped by long inward labor, enters the storm with another kind of strength, a strength that can sit with unbearable news, a strength that can endure uncertainty, a strength that can grieve and still decide, a strength that does not need to sound invincible to be real. And perhaps that is why this chapter belongs so naturally in the center of a bedtime history. Because here you encounter one of the deepest truths of quiet leadership. The storm does not create the soul. It reveals the soul that has already been formed in silence. Everything earlier in the story has been prepared. The cabin, the woods, the books, the law, the melancholy, the tenderness, the careful public voice, all of it now enters the great trial. And so as this chapter closes, picture not a battlefield, but a room. A room in the White House. Night outside, papers spread across a desk, candles burning low. The new president seated in thought, tall and weary, carrying already more than most men are ever asked to bear. The house is quiet for the moment. The nation is not. Somewhere in the distance, trains move. Messengers travel. Mothers pray. Young soldiers prepare. Old certainties vanish. And Lincoln sits in the center of it all. Not untouched, not untroubled, but steady. He has entered the storm. And the storm, vast as it is, has not yet reached its full force. Now, let the night deepen. You have followed him into the storm, into the first great shudder of rupture, into the winter of election and oath, into that solemn crossing from argument into war. And now the story enters one of its most searching chambers, not the noise of battle itself, but the strange and burdened quiet within leadership during war. For while nations move through headlines, marches, and proclamations, a great part of leadership happens elsewhere. In rooms, pauses, in letters opened beneath low light, in footsteps heard late at night along a corridor when others have already gone to sleep. So let your breathing slow and imagine the White House after midnight. Not the bright ceremonial house of receptions and official portraits, but the house as it becomes when the hour is late and the nation is troubled. Lamps burn low in distant rooms. Papers lie in ordered stacks and disordered piles. The air carries wax, wool, ink, old wood, fatigue. Outside, Washington rests uneasily beneath the dark. Inside, one man remains awake longer than he wishes, because wakefulness has become part of the office. And there he is, Abraham Lincoln, seated, standing, pacing, sitting again, tall, worn, inwardly crowded by more grief and uncertainty than the body was ever meant to carry alone. This is not the dramatic loneliness of legend. It is quieter, more human, the loneliness of responsibility, the loneliness of knowing that every dispatch may alter the lives of thousands, the loneliness of choosing without perfect clarity, the loneliness of bearing criticism from those who think you too slow and from those who think you too bold, the loneliness of being unable, however compassionate you may be, to spare everyone from suffering. War does this to leadership. It turns decision into burden. And Lincoln, who had always been serious beneath his humor, now becomes serious in ways even he may once not have imagined. The old inwardness remains, but it has changed in scale. The questions are no longer about one case, one speech, one election, one household. They are now national questions, terrible in size, intimate in consequence. Who shall command? How long can the Union endure this strain? How much sacrifice can a people bear? What words can steady without deceiving? What firmness is necessary? What mercy remains possible? And perhaps most painful of all, how does a leader continue to carry the sorrow of many without becoming numb? That question lingers over this whole chapter. Because the quiet power of Lincoln in these years lies not only in what he decides, but in what he refuses to lose while deciding. He does not become untouched. He does not become stone. He continues to feel. Imagine him reading casualty reports. Do not imagine them graphically. Imagine them as names, numbers, places, all the terrible abstraction by which grief first enters official life. A battle far away, a field whose name will soon be known in every household. A dispatch from a general, a telegram with too many dead, a letter from a mother, a plea from a wife, a petition for mercy, a request for pardon, a father asked where his son has gone. Leadership at war is often this, a steady stream of human sorrow translated into documents. And Lincoln reads. He reads not as a machine, but as a man with a conscience. There is something profoundly moving in that image. A president in a divided republic, burdened beyond measure, still trying to remain morally awake to individual suffering. He cannot answer every plea as the heart might wish. He cannot prevent all grief. He cannot govern as though the nation were a single family gathered safely in one room. Yet he continues, whenever possible, to see the person within the paper. This is why stories of his wartime mercy endure. His heart was not careless with young lives. He knew discipline mattered. He knew armies required order. He knew desertion and panic could not simply be waved aside. And yet he also knew fear, exhaustion, youth confusion, homesickness, and the frailty of ordinary human courage. Again, he seems to have wrestled with these realities, not as abstractions, but as moral tensions. Justice asked one thing, mercy whispered another. He listened to both. You can imagine such evenings well. A file is brought in. An appeal rests on the desk. A life hangs in the balance. The room is quiet except for the turning of paper. And Lincoln, already weighed by national crisis, pauses to consider one trembling human fate. This is stillness inside war. Not passivity, not avoidance, but the insistence that even amid vast conflict, the soul must not entirely surrender its tenderness. Of course, tenderness in a leader is not easy. It can be misunderstood. Some will call it weakness. Some will treat caution as indecision, compassion as softness, reflection as delay. During these years, Lincoln would endure impatience from many directions. He had to manage generals, politicians, rival egos, newspaper storms, factional pressures, public fear. He had to endure the ache of events moving more slowly than hope and more violently than conscience. How exhausting that must have been. You may feel it now not as a fact alone, but as atmosphere. The White House is never fully at rest. Footsteps come and go. Doors open, voices confer, messengers arrive. War does not sleep simply because night has fallen. And yet Lincoln seeks within that ceaseless motion some inward stillness from which to think. Perhaps this is why he often turned to the telegraph office, that strange chamber of modern urgency where distant fields and commands entered the capital in clipped messages. There is something almost haunting about it, the leader waiting for news that has already happened elsewhere, unable to stop it, able only to respond after the fact. To lead in such conditions is to dwell continuously between action and aftermath. You may picture him there in the dimness, listening, waiting, reading what arrives from far away. His face grows more lined. His body is more tired. The burden of command does not only fill the mind, it enters the flesh. It settles in the shoulders, the eyes, the gait. Years seem to gather quickly upon him. And still, he does not become theatrical in his suffering. This, too, is part of his quiet greatness. He does not ask the nation to admire the difficulty of his burden. He simply carries it, sometimes with wariness, sometimes with humor, sometimes, no doubt, with inward anguish so deep it could scarcely be spoken. But he carries it, and then, within the wider sorrow of the nation, private sorrow strikes again. In the White House itself, death enters not as statistic, but as beloved presence lost. Willie, the child so cherished, falls ill and dies, and the house of government becomes once more a house of mourning. Pause here gently. The grief of parents belongs to a sacred silence. It is one of the deepest wounds a household can know. And for Lincoln, whose emotional life was already marked by tenderness and melancholy, this loss must have pressed into the very center of his being. The war continued. Cabinets still met. Dispatches still arrived. The machinery of government did not stop. But underneath it all, the father grieved. You may imagine the hallway quieter than before, a room no longer filled by a child's motion. Mary shattered in sorrow. Lincoln moved through duty with fresh absence inside him. This is one of the most revealing truths of his presidency. The public burden and the private wound coexisted. He was not permitted the luxury of retreating from history in order to mourn as an ordinary father might have wished. He had to keep working while grief remained alive in the rooms around him. And perhaps that is why his compassion widened even further. Loss can close the heart, but it can also deepen it. In Lincoln, it seems so often to have deepened it. You may feel now how the whole story is converging. The child who lost his mother, the husband acquainted with melancholy, the father wounded by grief, the president carrying the casualties of war, all these selves remain present at once. Nothing is neatly left behind. The earlier sorrows do not disappear. They become part of the way he understands suffering when it returns in larger forms. This is why his leadership feels so human. He is not above sorrow. He leads through it. And because he leads through it, his words gain a different texture. They are not merely clever or strategic. They are seasoned. They carry the hush of someone who has stood beside too much grief to speak lightly. Yet even in grief, he keeps certain habits of light alive. Humor remains with him. Not shallow merriment, not indifference disguised as wit, rather humor as breathing space. Humor as a slender bridge over emotional darkness. Humor as a way to keep the spirit from collapsing entirely beneath the weight of reality. Those around Lincoln often noticed this quality in him, the way story and sadness lived close together. This is another quiet lesson. A gentle laugh in a dark season is not betrayal of seriousness. Sometimes it is one of the ways seriousness survives. So imagine him, late in the evening, after conferences and memoranda and troubling reports, speaking some brief story, some odd recollection, some moment of dry frontier wit that brings a tired smile to a room otherwise burdened by war. Such moments do not erase grief, but they soften the hard edges of despair. They remind those nearby that humanity still lives. Leadership is often judged by major decisions alone, but people are also steadied by tone, by presence, by whether the one at the center of crisis enlarges fear or quietly contains it. Lincoln contained much, not perfectly, no one could, but enough that others felt, even amid uncertainty, that the center had not wholly dissolved. You may imagine him visiting soldiers as well, not as spectacle, but as conscience drawing near to consequence. To investigate the faces of those who bear the war physically is to be recalled from abstraction. Lincoln's sympathy seems to have moved readily in such encounters. He did not view young men merely as instruments of policy. He saw their humanity. He understood, perhaps more than many leaders, that the burdens of war settled upon individual bodies and homes. Again and again, this is the stillness inside war, the refusal to let scale erase the person. At the same time, he must decide. That cannot be forgotten. Compassion without decision would not save the Union. Tenderness alone could not guide armies, appoint generals, preserve government, and hold together a fractured republic. Lincoln had to grow in authority, even while remaining inwardly gentle. He had to become firmer in command without becoming harsher in soul. This is no small achievement. Many people, once given power under pressure, begin to resemble the pressure itself. They harden into it. They become abrupt, severe, incapable of nuance. Lincoln's strength moved in another way. It became more defined, more deliberate, more resolved, but it did not entirely lose humility. You can sense this in the way he endured criticism. There was criticism from military men, criticism from party factions, criticism from abolitionists who wanted swifter action, criticism from conservatives who feared too much change, criticism from editors, rivals, disappointed allies, doubtful citizens. To lead quietly in such a climate is to endure misunderstanding as a daily companion. And still he continues. He studies the generals. He replaces some, waits on others, hopes for more than one proves able to deliver. He returns again to the central necessity the Union must hold. Yet beneath that necessity, another moral current is deepening, one that will soon reshape the meaning of war itself. But not quite yet. This chapter remains in the interval before transformation fully declares itself. An interval of burden, of sleeplessness, of fatherhood pierced by death, of national grief thickening month by month, of mercy and command, learning to live within the same man. So let the image narrow once more toward quiet. It is very late now. The White House corridors are still. A lamp burns in one room longer than the others. Lincoln sits alone, a document before him, his face lined by care. Perhaps he leans back for a moment and closes his eyes. Perhaps he rises and walks to the window. Perhaps he looks into the dark without really seeing it because the mind is too full. And yet, somewhere beneath exhaustion, there remains that inward steadiness you have been following from the beginning. Not certainty in all things, not ease, not relief, but steadiness. The woods gave him silence. The books gave him thought. The law gave him discipline. Love gave him tenderness. Grief gave him depth. And now war asks whether all of these can be held together under unbearable strain. So far they can. And when you are ready, the next chapter will carry you toward one of the great moral turnings of his life and presidency, when the struggle to preserve the nation begins more clearly to join itself to the struggle for freedom. Now let the story move into a deeper light. You have walked with Lincoln through burden, waiting, grief, and the long inward labor of wartime leadership. You have sat with him in those late rooms where telegrams arrived like cold winds through a closed house, where names became numbers and numbers became sorrow, where the fate of the Union rested not only on armies, but on the conscience of the man who had sworn to preserve it. And now something within that conscience is widening. The war, at first, had been spoken of chiefly as a struggle to save the nation, to hold together what was breaking apart, to preserve the Union against dissolution. That task remained immense and sacred to Lincoln. He believed deeply that the Republic must endure, that a government of the people could not be allowed to perish through fracture and force. But history does not always let a moral struggle remain narrow. Sometimes suffering enlarges the question. Sometimes bloodshed tears away old evasions. Sometimes what begins as one duty opens into another, deeper, harder, more luminous duty that had been waiting beneath the first all along. And so the war begins to change in meaning. Not for everyone at once, not without resistance, not without caution, fear, calculation, and anguish, but steadily, as though the nation, wounded and exhausted, were being asked to look more honestly at its own soul. You may feel that transition tonight as a change in atmosphere. The White House remains burdened. The corridors remain hushed. The maps remain spread across tables, but there is now another current moving through the air, moral, searching, irreversible. Lincoln had always opposed the spread of slavery. That conviction was not new, yet leadership in a time of crisis often demands more than private conviction. It demands the terrible patience to know when a truth can be spoken, when it can be acted upon, and when action, though costly, has become necessary. This is one of the most difficult burdens of quiet leadership. The loud leader often speaks as though timing were simple. The quieter leader knows that timing can determine whether a moral act will stand or collapse before it can do the good it intends. And so Lincoln waited, not because he lacked conscience, but because conscience in public life often has to walk through circumstance as well as principle. He had to think not only of what was right in the abstract, but of what could preserve the Union, hold fragile loyalties, sustain armies, and carry the nation toward freedom without losing the very ground on which freedom might survive. How lonely such waiting must have been. Some urged him forward, some warned him back, some thought him too cautious, some feared he had already gone too far. And all the while, the war itself pressed harder, teaching through suffering what politics alone had refused to learn. You may imagine Lincoln laid at his desk again, not restless in the same way as before, but more resolved. The deep work of moral judgment is taking place. It is not the work of a moment. It is not a flash of theatrical certainty. It is something slower, sterner, more prayerful. A nation is being tested. A president is being tested. And beneath both tests lie a greater one. Can the struggle to save the Union become also a struggle worthy of being saved? That is the question expanding before him. And with it comes one of the great acts of his life. The Emancipation Proclamation is often remembered in history as a document, a date, a decision. But tonight, let it be felt first as an inward crossing, a threshold in the soul of leadership, a moment when preservation and liberation draw nearer to one another, and the war begins to speak more clearly, not only of national survival, but of human freedom. Do not imagine the moment as triumph without shadow. Lincoln knew its limits. He knew what it did and did not immediately do. He knew that words on paper, even presidential words, could not instantly heal centuries of injustice. He knew the nation was still divided, and that many hearts remained chained even where laws might begin to loosen. And yet words matter. Words do not complete history, but they can turn it. A proclamation can become a doorway. A sentence can become a widening river. A public act, though imperfect in reach, can announce that the moral center of a struggle has shifted. So imagine the room where thought becomes document. Paper before him, ink waiting, the weight of timing, consequence, resistance, and hope gathered into the hand. Outside, the war continues. Nothing grows quiet simply because a righteous decision is near. But inside that room, something becomes clear. The Union cause must be joined more fully to freedom. The nation cannot merely survive physically, it must be called toward moral transformation. This is why the chapter feels so sacred. Not because history has become simple here. It does not. But because a leader, formed by sorrow and restraint, begins to align national purpose more openly with moral truth. And that alignment changes everything. You may feel its quiet grandeur. The war is no longer only about holding together states and borders. It is now more openly about what kind of nation will emerge from the suffering, whether power will defend bondage or turn against it, whether the republic will be merely preserved or enlarged in meaning. This is what I mean by the expanding soul of the nation. For nations, like people, they can live below their principles for a very long time. They can speak noble words and yet keep rooms of shadow locked inside themselves. They can praise liberty while withholding it. They can recite ideals while fearing their consequences. But crisis sometimes forces a reckoning. And Lincoln, who had spent so much of his life learning to carry complexity without surrendering moral seriousness, becomes the one through whom that reckoning moves toward form. Do not miss how fitted he is, in his own imperfect human way, for this task. A louder man might have rushed into symbolism without securing endurance. A colder man might have acted without reverence for consequence. A weaker man might have remained trapped between factions forever. A vain man might have loved the grandeur of the gesture more than the burden it imposed. Lincoln, by contrast, seems to have understood the cost. He knew such a step would deepen opposition in some quarters. He knew it would be watched abroad. He knew it would change the character of the war. He knew it would call forth fresh hatred as well as fresh hope. And still he moved. Quiet leadership is not reluctant forever. It is often reluctant until the moment when delay becomes betrayal. And then it acts. The Emancipation Proclamation enters the world in this spirit, grave, deliberate, imperfect in immediate reach, and yet immense in moral direction. It does not end all slavery at once. It does not instantly remake every condition, but it changes the meaning of the conflict. It declares that freedom is no longer merely an implied hope hidden beneath Union language. It is now a stated cause, a public commitment, a moral horizon. Imagine how such words must have traveled. Through camps, through newspapers, through parlors and churches and frightened households, through whispers among the enslaved, through hearts scarcely daring to trust what they heard, through corridors of government, through foreign eyes watching to see what this nation would become. Some received it with joy, some with fury, some with doubt, some with exhausted gratitude. But history had turned, and Lincoln knew, perhaps more deeply than most around him, that once certain truths are spoken by a nation's highest office, even imperfectly, the old moral evasions begin to lose their shelter. Now let the chapter widen further, because emancipation was not only about declaration. It was also about transformation in human participation. African American men would serve more directly in the Union cause, and this, too, changed the war's meaning. How profound that is. A nation at war with itself begins to move, however incompletely, toward a future in which those once treated as property stand as agents in the remaking of its destiny. Lincoln recognized the significance of this. Quietly, steadily, he seemed to understand that the moral force of the Union was becoming inseparable from the claims of those whose freedom had too long been deferred. There is a solemn beauty in that recognition. Not sentimental beauty, not easy beauty, but the beauty of the truth emerging through great cost. You may imagine Lincoln reflecting on this not with self-congratulation, but with burdened awareness. He was not the sole author of freedom's struggle. Countless enslaved people, abolitionists, soldiers, reformers, and witnesses had carried this cause in suffering and courage long before his signature helped redirect the nation's course. Perhaps that is another reason his role feels so deeply suited to quiet leadership, When he stands at a turning point, he does not erase the deeper moral river. He helps the nation enter it. And what does such entry require of the soul? To know that history is larger than one office. To know that justice delayed wounds generations. To know that one may still serve something greater than oneself, even while arriving late to its full demands. Lincoln's greatness often lives there, not in perfection from the beginning, but in growth toward moral clarity. He listened to the age, to suffering, to war, to principle, to necessity, and he allowed that listening to deepen him. That is no small thing. Many leaders hear only what confirms them. The wiser ones let reality enlarge them. As you rest in the still cadence of this chapter, imagine another night in Washington. The document has been signed. The burden is not gone. If anything, it has deepened. The war continues. Men will still die. Critics will still speak. Victory is still uncertain. And yet, something has changed in the moral air. The nation's language has shifted. The future has opened by another degree. Freedom, though not complete, stands nearer to the center of national purpose than before. Lincoln sits in the aftermath of that turning, not triumphant, but thoughtful. He knows history does not move in a straight line. He knows backlash can be fierce. He knows declarations must be followed by endurance. But perhaps in some quiet chamber of the heart, he also knows that war is now tethered more openly to a truth worthy of sacrifice. This gives the whole struggle a different depth. To preserve a nation is one thing. To preserve it while summoning it toward justice is another. And that second calling, however incomplete, is what begins to transform Lincoln's place in history, from capable wartime president to moral steward of a national rebirth. Not because he acted without caution, not because he was untouched by politics, not because every answer came cleanly, but because in the end, when the hour demanded it, he moved the republic toward a broader understanding of freedom than the one with which it had entered the war. That is the expanding soul of the nation. A painful expansion, a contested expansion, an unfinished expansion, but real. So let this chapter end in reverent quiet. No cheering crowds, no theatrical flourish, only a lamplit room, a signed document, a weary president carrying both history and sorrow in the same frame, and beyond the window, a nation still wounded, still divided, yet now turning toward a larger moral dawn. The war is not over. The heaviest words are still to come, but the path beneath those words has changed. Now, let the story come gently to a field of remembrance, not with haste, not with noise, but with that slow, reverent step by which one approaches ground made sacred by sorrow. You have followed Lincoln through the deepening years of war, through grief that entered both the nation and his own house, through the widening moral horizon of emancipation, through the burden of trying to preserve tenderness while bearing command. And now the path leads to Gettysburg. Even the name arrives softly tonight. Gettysburg, a place that became, in the life of the nation, more than a town, more than a map point, more than the site of a battle. It became a threshold of memory, a place where loss gathered so heavily that language itself had to become more careful in its presence. So imagine the journey there, not as a triumphal procession, but as a pilgrimage of duty. Autumn lingers in the air. The light is pale and measured. The land carries the hush that follows great disturbance. Fields that once belonged to ordinary rural rhythms now hold another kind of stillness. Not the stillness of untouched nature, but the stillness that comes after human grief has passed across the earth and changed it forever. Lincoln travels there as president, yes, but also as mourner, as witness, as the man who has spent these long war years learning how sorrow deepens speech. You may picture him arriving not in grandeur, but in thought. The gathered people are many. Officials, families, soldiers, local citizens, visitors, all drawn there by memory, duty, reverence, and the human need to mark loss with meaning. There will be formalities, there will be ceremonial order, there will be the language of dedication. But beneath it all lies something simpler and older. The living has come to stand beside the dead, and to ask what must now be remembered. This question matters. For memory, it can be shallow and it can be sacred. Shallow memory wants only names and dates, perhaps a polished monument, perhaps a familiar phrase repeated until it no longer pierces the heart. Sacred memory asks more. What suffered here? What responsibility remains with us because of it? What must change in the living if the dead are not to be merely praised, but honored. Lincoln seems always most powerful when language touches that deeper register. And so, before he speaks, let the scene settle around you. The day is cool, the sky is restrained, neither dramatic nor empty. People stand in coats and hats, their breath perhaps faints in the air. There is motion, but also waiting. The very ground seems to request quiet. At such a place, long speech can seem almost incapable of meeting the moment, for there are sorrows too large for ornament. There are losses too solemn to bear excessive eloquence. Lincoln, who had long been learning how to pare language down until it held only what mattered most, was uniquely fitted for this kind of hour. That is part of the beauty of Gettysburg. He does not try to outshout grief. He does not try to conquer mourning with rhetoric. He does something rarer. He speaks briefly, and within that brevity, he opens a depth large enough for a people to enter. This is quiet leadership at one of its purest moments. A lesser speaker might have mistaken scale for greatness, might have believed that importance required length, might have layered phrase upon phrase until the living were distanced from the dead by language itself. Lincoln moves in the opposite direction. He becomes simpler, more exact, humbler before the occasion. You can imagine him rising now. Tall, worn, composed, the face marked by the war's long strain. The inwardness is still there, though history now rests visibly upon him. Around him there are others more ceremonially fitted to public display. There has already been longer speaking, learned speaking, formal speaking, but Lincoln's gift in such moments is not display. It is concentration. He knows, perhaps instinctively, that the truest words for such a field must not call attention first to the speaker. They must turn the heart toward the sacrifice itself, and beyond sacrifice, toward the unfinished duty it places upon the living. And so his address unfolds like a bell heard in clear air, measured, small in length, fast in echo. He begins not with himself, but with time, with the nation's birth, with the proposition at its center. This is one of the quiet miracles of his speech. He lifts the moment out of mere immediate grief and places it within the longer moral life of the Republic. Not to escape the sorrow of the day, but to let the sorrow be understood in its deepest meaning. The nation was conceived in liberty. This was not simply historical recollection. It was moral recollection, a calling back to first principles, a reminder that what was being tested on that field was not only military endurance, but the truth of the Republic's own founding claim. And then, in only a few movements, he does something profound. He acknowledges the field, he honors the dead, and yet he refuses to let ceremony rest in tribute alone. This is where the speech becomes sacred, because Lincoln understands that the dead do not need ornamental praise nearly as much as the living need moral awakening. To dedicate the ground is not enough. To say solemn words is not enough. To weep, though human and necessary, is not enough. Living must be changed. The nation must be renewed in purpose. Sacrifice must become obligation. You may feel the stillness of that insight. How often human beings gather at places of loss and wish understandably that memory itself was sufficient. But Lincoln asks for more, gently, solemnly, almost prayerfully. He asks the living to take up the unfinished work, to be dedicated anew, to understand that grief, if it is to become honorable, must be transformed into responsibility. What a remarkable thing to say in so few words, and perhaps only a man shaped as he was could have said it so truly. The child of hardship, the reader by firelight, the lawyer disciplined by clarity, the father acquainted with grief, the wartime president carrying casualty upon casualty in his soul. All these selves speak in Gettysburg. Not loudly, but completely. This is why the address endures. Not merely because it is elegant, not merely because it is famous, but because it sounds as though sorrow itself has been taught to speak with humility and hope at once. Imagine the listeners. Some hear the words and recognize immediately their gravity. Some perhaps do not fully understand at first how much has been said. Some simply feel the hush that follows them. For sacred words often do not strike like thunder. They settle, they deepen, they return later in the memory with greater force. Lincoln's address is that quality. It leaves space around itself. It does not crowd the listener. It opens a chamber and lets the conscience enter. And what does the conscience find there? That the nation must have a new birth of freedom. Pause on that softly. A new birth, not a restoration only, not a repair that returns everything to what it was, but a birth something morally enlarged, painfully brought forth through suffering, unfinished and fragile, yet real. This is why Gettysburg belongs so naturally after emancipation in the arc of this story. At Gettysburg, Lincoln speaks as though the Union and freedom are no longer separable destinies. The nation can survive only by becoming more fully true to the principle that gave it life. And that insight comes wrapped not in bitterness, but in solemn hope. There is no cruelty in the speech, no indulgence in hatred, no noisy triumph over the defeated. Only grief, humility, duty, and a call to moral perseverance. It is the speech of a man who has been chastened by suffering enough to distrust grandiosity. A man who knows that words spoken above the dead must be worthy of silence as much as speech. You can imagine, after he finishes, that peculiar kind of quiet which follows words that have gone deeper than applause. People shift, breathe, look out over the field. Something has been said that cannot be easily reduced. The day continues, yet inwardly it has changed. And Lincoln himself, perhaps he returns afterward, not with the satisfaction of a performer, but with the inward reserve of one who has done what duty required and now leaves the words to their own life in the world. That, too, is part of quiet leadership, to speak faithfully, then release. You may picture him later, away from the crowd. The carriage moving, the day dimming, the field receding into distance, his face turned inward once more. Did he know fully what he had given the nation that day? Perhaps not in the grand sense later ages would claim. Great speech often moves beyond the speaker's own measure of it. But he likely knew this much, that the war had to be named in moral terms commensurate with its cost, and that living had to be called upward into something noble than mourning alone. This is what Gettysburg accomplishes. It consecrates memory by linking it to duty. It sanctifies sorrow by binding it to purpose. It turns a cemetery into a school of national conscience. No wonder the address feels almost scriptural in its endurance. It does what the highest public language can do. It becomes brief enough to remember, deep enough to live with, humble enough to trust. And in the larger arc of Lincoln's life, Gettysburg reveals how far he has traveled from the cabin and the frontier road, yet also how fully he remains the same. He is still plain in a way that clears space for truth, still inward, still measured, still distrustful of unnecessary adornment, still guided by a moral seriousness that has grown gentler, not harder, under the weight of suffering. That is the secret at the heart of this chapter. War could have made him coarser. It did not. Loss could have made him narrower. It did not. Power could have made him theatrical. It did not. Instead, grief distilled him. And at Gettysburg, what emerged was not just presidential speech, but a form of national prayer. A prayer in public language. A prayer for meaning. A prayer for perseverance. A prayer that the dead have not died in vain. A prayer that democracy itself might survive the age's great testing. So let this chapter close slowly, with the field now quiet beneath evening light. The people have begun to leave. The ceremony is over. The air grows colder, shadows lengthen over the resting place of the dead. And somewhere, carried beyond the field by memory, Lincoln's words continue to travel. Into homes, into schools, into the inner life of the nation, into generations yet unborn, into hearts that will need again to remember that grief can be met with humility, and that humility can still call a people toward hope. When you are ready, the next chapter will bring you to the spiritual summit of Lincoln's public life, where charity, mercy, and moral firmness will be held together in one of the gentlest and strongest visions of leadership ever spoken. Now, let the story ascend into its quiet summit. You have come with Lincoln through wilderness and books, through courtrooms, marriage, sorrow, election, war, emancipation, and Gettysburg's sacred field. You have watched his life deepen under pressure, rather than grow coarse. You have heard his voice become smaller in ornaments and greater in truth. And now you arrive at one of the most tender and solemn heights of his public life, a moment when power speaks not in pride, but in humility, not in vengeance, but in mercy. The war is drawing toward its end, not ended, not quite, but nearing that last aching bend in the road where weariness, grief, and hope begin to mingle in difficult proportion. The country has suffered too long to greet the future lightly. Too many homes have been empty. Too many letters have been unfolded with trembling hands. Too many names have been carried from battlefield to family Bible, from shouted roll call to whispered prayer. And yet, because the end seems nearer, another temptation begins to rise. The temptation of triumph. The temptation to say, now that victory appears possible, that suffering has earned bitterness. That power, once secured, may answer injury with injury. That the proper language of the wounded victor is hardness. This is the temptation Lincoln now faces in full view of the nation. And what he offers instead is one of the most extraordinary acts of quiet leadership in history. So let the scene settle around you. Washington again, but changed by years of war. The city has become a vessel for anxiety, command, waiting, and mourning. Yet now there is also a strange brightness in the air. Not the brightness of celebration, but of strained expectancy. The conflict that has consumed the Republic may soon close. The questions that have burned through battlefields will soon become questions of reunion, repair, justice, and memory. How shall the nation live after such division? How shall the victorious treat the defeated? How shall law answer rebellion? How shall freedom be secured? How shall the dead be honored in the life that follows? And beneath all of these, perhaps the deepest question of all, what kind of spirit will govern peace? Lincoln knows that peace to come may be almost as difficult as the war. Battles, however terrible, can concentrate the mind. Peace demands something more complicated. It asks for imagination. It asks for restraint after rage. It asks for justice without cruelty. It asks for moral seriousness without self-righteousness. It asks wounded people to remain human. That is hard. Harder, perhaps, than many admit. And Lincoln, shaped as he has been by sorrow and humility, seems to understand this with unusual depth. So when he rises to speak at his second inauguration, he does not speak as a conqueror intoxicated by history. He does not declare himself great. He does not indulge the easy moral vanity of those who believe suffering has made them pure. He does not flatter the nation by pretending innocence where there has been guilt, or simplicity where there has been moral entanglement. Instead, he speaks as though standing beneath judgment rather than above it. This is the stillness of true greatness. Imagine the day, the assembled crowd, the cool air, the weight of national attention. The man before them, older now, more worn, his face marked by years that seemed to have passed through him like weather through old wood. He has changed, not only in appearance, though that is visible. He has changed in spiritual tone. The war chastened him. Grief has ripened him. Responsibility has stripped him. Ever might once have been merely rhetorical. What remains is something plainer, deeper, almost biblical in gravity. You can feel it before the words fully unfold. This will not be the speech of a man interested in applause. It will be the speech of a man trying to speak honestly beneath the gaze of God, history, and the dead. And so he does something astonishing. He refuses to make the war into a drama of pure innocence on one side and total impurity on the other. He does not excuse rebellion. He does not deny the Union cause. He does not step away from moral clarity. But he also recognizes that slavery was not a wound belonging only to one region in some abstract sense. It was a national sin, a national inheritance, a national burden. How rare such honesty is in public life. How easy it would have been to flatter the crowd instead. How easy it is to divide the world into the righteous us and the wicked them. But Lincoln has lived too near grief, too near history, too near moral seriousness to indulge that kind of simplification. This is why his language feels so enduring. It is humble without being weak, firm without being cruel, moral without becoming vain. He speaks as one who understands that suffering has fallen across the whole land. And in doing so, he lifts the nation out of the pettier satisfactions of partisan victory and into a more solemn chamber of reflection. Perhaps this is the deepest form of quiet leadership, to guide people away from the emotional pleasures that would diminish them. To refuse easy hatred when hatred would be welcomed. To call a wounded nation upward when it would be simpler to let it sink into revenge. That is what Lincoln does here. He invites the country to see the war not merely as a contest won, but as an ordeal through which judgment, sorrow, and moral reckoning have passed over all. You may imagine the effect of such words upon those listening. Some would feel elevated by them, some unsettled, some perhaps unable fully to receive them in the moment. For humility, especially collective humility, is not always what crowds most desire, and yet Lincoln offers it anyway. He offers a vision in which power bows before responsibility, a vision in which suffering becomes not permission for cruelty, but a summons to mercy. And then come those immortal words, words so gentle and so strong that they seem to gather the whole arc of his life into a single moral phrase. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Pause there softly, not as quotation alone, as atmosphere, as ethic, as the distilled essence of the man you have been following from the beginning. With malice toward none, not because no wrong has been done, not because justice no longer matters, not because pain should be forgotten, but because malice deforms the soul that carries it. And with charity for all, not sentimental charity, not careless leniency, not the charity that excuses everything because it fears difficulty. No, something sterner and holier than that. The charity that sees human frailty even in the enemy. The charity that remembers grief is not held by one side alone. The charity that knows peace built on humiliation will carry seeds of future sorrow. The charity that can be firm in the right while refusing hatred as a way of being. This is Lincoln's mature moral vision, and how beautifully it fits the whole story. The child who knew loss learned tenderness. The young man who read by firelight learned inward discipline. The lawyer learned to listen. The melancholy husband and father learned depth. The wartime president learned endurance. And now, at the edge of victory, the leader reveals what all that inward formation was preparing him for. Not domination, but mercy. You may feel, as you rest with this chapter, that mercy here is not soft in the lesser sense. It is strength purified. Anyone can hate when grief is fresh. Anyone can retaliate when power is finally theirs. Anyone can demand emotional satisfaction from history. But to seek to bind up wounds, that requires a rarer courage. Lincoln's phrase about binding up the nation's wounds carries perhaps more tenderness than almost any political language ever spoken. It imagines the country not as a machine to be restarted, nor simply as a victor to be crowned, but as a wounded body in need of care. What a remarkable metaphor for a leader to choose. Not punishment first, not boasting, not self-congratulation, wounds and binding them. It is the language of healing hands, of patience, of medicine, of attention to pain. It is a human image, intimate rather than grand. And because it is intimate, it reaches deeper. It reminds the listener that nations are made of living people, grieving people, stubborn people, frightened people, people who bleed, bury, remember, and try to continue. This is why Lincoln's leadership at its height feels almost pastoral, not in the sense of retreating from politics, but in the sense of tending souls while guiding people. He knows law will be needed. Policy will be needed. Reconstruction will demand structure and firmness. Yet beneath all that, if the nation is to endure morally, it must not be taught to love bitterness. What a radical restraint that is. The age could easily have turned harsher. Indeed, parts of it would. But Lincoln's voice in this moment stands like a lamp in a dark corridor, showing another way. Not a naive way, not a painless way, but a way more worthy of the sorrow already endured. You may imagine him after the speech, not basking, but quiet again. The words have gone out into the air. They belong now to the nation. He cannot control how they will be received, only that they were spoken faithfully. This, too, is part of quiet leadership, to release words without grasping at their glory. And in the days that follow, he continues to think not merely of ending conflict, but of how peace must be shaped. There is gentleness in his instinct toward reunion, though never a complete abandonment of principle. He does not dream of peace as he is forgetting. He dreams of peace as restoration without malice, justice without hatred, firmness without spiritual corruption. That dream feels fragile, perhaps because all healing is fragile at first. A wound cannot be shouted closed. A wound cannot be mocked into mending. A wound cannot be healed by the very bitterness that caused it to deepen. It must be tended, patiently, carefully, truthfully. Lincoln seems to know this in his bones. And maybe that is why this chapter feels like the spiritual summit of the entire story. For here, more than anywhere else, the hidden pattern becomes clear. Everything you have witnessed in him, the inwardness, the sorrow, the moral seriousness, the refusal of noise, the compassion that survived pressure, all of it flowers into a public ethic of astonishing grace. A lesser life might have ended in hardness. He rises into charity, not because he is untouched by pain, but because pain has taught him the cost of adding more. Now let the pace grow even softer. The war is nearly over. The country trembles on the edge of reunion and uncertainty. Lincoln, though still burdened, speaks from a place of unusual clarity. He has become, in these final public moments, almost a guardian of moral atmosphere, trying to shape not only what the nation does, but the spirit in which it does it. That is why his words endure beyond policy. Policies belong to their hour. Atmospheres of moral truth belong to centuries. With malice toward none is not merely a sentence for a single political moment. It is an instruction for wounded human beings of every age, a reminder that justice without charity becomes cruelty in finer clothes, a reminder that firmness without humility becomes self-righteousness, a reminder that peace built without mercy is only a quieter form of war. And yet, because history is history, because life does not always allow the gentlest spirit to complete the work it has envisioned, there is already, faintly, a sadness gathering at the edge of this chapter. Not fully spoken yet, only sensed, a sense that the man who offers the nation this healing vision may not be given long to guide its fulfillment. But that belongs to the final movement. For now, remain here. Remain in the radiance of the words, in the humility of the moment, in the image of a weary leader refusing hatred when hatred would have been easy, in the tenderness of a statesman speaking as though the highest duty of power were not revenge but repair. This is Abraham Lincoln at the height of quiet leadership, not noiseless because he has nothing to say, not gentle because he lacks resolve, but gentle because resolve in him has been purified by sorrow and governed by conscience. So let this chapter close like evening prayer. The address is finished. The crowd disperses slowly. The Capitol settles into dusk. And somewhere within the fading light, Lincoln's words remain suspended over the nation, like a blessing it has not yet fully learned how to receive. When you are ready, one final chapter remains. A chapter of farewell, of memory, of the lamp left burning after the hand that tended it is gone. Now let the story grow softer still. You have come a long way beside him, from the cabin and the trees, from the cold frontier dark and the patient firelight, from books borrowed and thoughts gathered by littles, from roads and courtrooms, from love and melancholy, from war rooms and midnight burdens, from Gettysburg's sacred hush and the high mercy of with malice toward none. And now the path narrows, not into emptiness, into stillness. For every life, no matter how large it becomes in history, we must at last return to the oldest human truths: a room, a body, a breath, a farewell, a memory carried onward by others. The war is nearing its end. The terrible struggle that has consumed so many years, so many homes, so many names, is beginning at last to loosen its grip. There is still suffering, still uncertainty, still grief moving through the land like weather that has not fully passed. But there is also a new tone in the air, faint at first, then clearer. Not joy exactly, not yet. Something gentler, relief mixed with exhaustion, hope mixed with disbelief. The road of peace is appearing, though no one can see all that waits along it. And Lincoln, who has carried the nation through its darkest trial, seems in these last days both wearier and lighter. You may imagine it. A man long bent inward by responsibility beginning, just slightly, to lift. Not because the losses are forgotten. They are not. Not because sorrow has been undone. It cannot be. But because the possibility of healing, long spoken of in faith, is now drawing nearer to earthly form. The great rebellion is collapsing. The end of war feels close enough to touch. And Lincoln, whose mind has spent years fixed upon preservation, emancipation, reunion, and the moral cost of every decision, begins to look ahead toward rebuilding. This is important to linger over, because history sometimes tells his ending too quickly, as though his life were only a tragic conclusion. But before the final darkness, there was also light, a real light, a human light, a brief and tender opening in which the future seemed, if not simple, at least possible. He could imagine the nation binding up its wounds. He could imagine a peace shaped not by vengeance, but by restoration. He could imagine the work continuing beyond war, hard work, unfinished work, morally demanding work, but work done under a quieter sky. And perhaps after so many years of strain, he allowed himself for a moment to breathe within that possibility. Pause there with him. The war has almost ended. The burden has not disappeared, but it has shifted. He is still president, still watched, still needed. Yet the pressure of mere survival has begun to ease. How rare that must have felt, to live for years under storm and then sense, however briefly, the edge of clearing. You may picture the White House in one of those final evenings. Not carefree, never carefree, but touched by another mood. A house that has held mourning, telegraphs, consultations, weary footsteps, and sleepless decision-making now holds, if only faintly, the first softness of after. Conversation turns toward what may come next. The future, so long obscured by war, begins to gather outline. And Lincoln, for all the lines sorrow has carved into him, remains strangely gentle at the center. This is one of the great marvels of his life. Power did not harden him beyond recognition. Suffering did not make him cruel. Responsibility did not destroy his tenderness. The lamp within him, that inward flame of patience, humility, melancholy, humor, and moral seriousness, burns to the end. That is why the story feels less like the rise of a politician and more like the unfolding of a soul. Now let the evening deepen. There is an outing planned, a theater, a few hours of ordinary pleasure in the midst of extraordinary times. Even that detail feels touching tonight. A weary man, burdened by history, accepts a small human interval of ease. Not a grand ceremony, not a council chamber, simply an evening, a performance, the familiar hope that life might step for a moment outside the shadow of war. There is something achingly human in that. After all the sorrow, one quiet evening. After all the strain, a few hours of release. And perhaps this, too, is why the end of Lincoln's life moves the heart so deeply. He is not taken at the height of triumphal noise, but almost in the threshold of rest. Almost in the first hour when the soul, long vigilant, begins to unclench. As all listeners do, what is coming? But the story need not rush there. Let it come gently. Let the night remain whole for a little longer. Picture the city outside, Washington under evening sky, carriages moving, doors opening, people dressed for the event. The ordinary motions of a night that does not yet know is about to become history. And Lincoln enters that evening still himself, weary, kind, perhaps carrying private thoughts no one else can fully see. A man who has led through fire and speaks now of healing. A man who has tried to spare the nation the poison of hatred, even after all it has suffered. A man whose greatness has always been quieter than the age around him. Then, in a single violent interruption, the earthly story is broken open. It is enough to say it softly. He is struck down. The nation that had leaned upon his steadiness is suddenly thrown into a deeper grief. The man who had spoken of charity, who had tried to guide the peace with mercy, is carried from the theater into the last fragile hours of life. And now the story is very still. A room, a bed, watchers gathered, the measured horror of those who understand that history itself seems to be holding its breath. It is not necessary, in a sleepy story, to dwell on violence. The deeper truth lies elsewhere. It lies in the silence that follows, in the helplessness of those nearby, in the stunned realization, spreading outward through the capital and then the nation, in the sudden transformation of one man's private body into the site of a people's public grief. Lincoln dies in the early morning, and with that breath, a chapter in the life of the Republic closes. You may imagine dawn arriving over Washington not as morning usually comes, but as morning made visible. The sky grows pale. The city wakes into disbelief. Word travels. Faces change as news passes from mouth to mouth. Rooms fall silent. Hats are removed. Tears rise unexpectedly. Men who argued against him feel the ground shift beneath them. Those who loved him cannot yet understand the size of what was taken. A nation already wounded is wounded again. And yet what is most moving is not only the shock of his death. It is the quality of grief. People mourn not merely a president, but a presence, a steadiness, a moral tone, a figure in whom authority had come to feel joined, however imperfectly, to humility and compassion. This is why the loss is so profound. The country did not only lose a leader, it lost the one who had tried, at the very edge of victory, to teach it how to be merciful. How heavy that must have felt. How frightening. For it is one thing to survive war. It is another way to survive the loss of the person whose spirit seemed most fitted to guide the peace. And here the chapter must rest for a while in mourning. Not rushed mourning, not decorative mourning, real mourning. Imagine the funeral train, the long passage homeward, towns and fields receiving him in sorrow. People gathered in stillness as the car passes. Black cloth, church bells, crowds standing in quiet witness, children lifted to see, old soldiers with bowed heads, mothers holding handkerchiefs, men staring ahead as though trying to understand what kind of country wakes after such a loss. This procession matters because it reveals something about the life that has ended. He belonged to them, not in the easy sense of popularity, in the deeper sense that ordinary people had recognized in him something of themselves refined into uncommon moral strength. The poor child, the laboring youth, the self-educated man, the listener, the mourner, the teller of stories, the president who spoke plainly and felt deeply, all of that made him legible to the human heart. He was great, but not inaccessible, and so they grieved him intimately, as though a tall, familiar tree had fallen, as though a lamp had gone out in a window they had long looked toward at night. Yet the title of this final chapter is not that the lamp was extinguished. It is that the lamp was left burning, because this is the mystery of certain lives. The body departs, but the moral light remains. Lincoln's work was unfinished. His hopes for reunion were unfinished. His vision of healing justice was unfinished. Even emancipation itself, though monumental, opened onto further struggles not yet complete. But unfinished is not the same as lost. Some lives finish by handing their deepest work to those who remain. And so the lamp stays burning. It burns in language, in the Gettysburg Address, where grief is turned toward duty, in the second inaugural, where power kneels before humility and charity, in the refusal of malice, in the insistence that national wounds must be bound, not deepened. It burns in memory, in the countless minds that have returned to his words, when the nation or the soul has once again grown divided. In every season, when noise grows loud, and someone remembers that quiet leadership can still be stronger than spectacle. In every heart that has suffered and yet resists becoming hard, it burns in example, in the long discipline of self-education, in the dignity of plain speech, in the courage to grow morally across a lifetime, in the capacity to hold sorrow without surrendering kindness. This is the true close of the story, not death alone. Legacy as atmosphere, legacy as tone, legacy as a way of being in the world. You may feel now how beautifully the whole life gathers together. The child in the cabin, reading by uncertain light. The young man learning law, learning people, learning language. The husband and father carrying tenderness and melancholy together. The leader who entered the storm without becoming storm-like himself. The president who bound union to freedom. The speaker who gave sacred words to sacred sorrow. The peacemaker who, at the threshold of victory, spoke not of revenge but of charity. All of him remains, not in marble first, in moral memory. And perhaps this is the final wisdom Lincoln offers the weary listener tonight. That greatness need not be loud to be lasting. That the deepest strength may be the strength that listens. That sorrow, though it darkens, can also enlarge the soul. That humility is not weakness, but a form of clarity. That mercy is not softness, but strength governed by conscience. That a life formed slowly, obscurely, honestly, can become a shelter for millions. These are not only historical lessons, they are human ones. If you listen closely, they travel beyond Abraham Lincoln and enter your own inward night. For perhaps you too know something of burden. Perhaps you too have lived through seasons that asked more of the heart than seemed fair. Perhaps you too have learned that outward calm can conceal deep labor of soul. Perhaps you too have wondered whether gentleness can survive in a difficult world. Lincoln's life answers, quietly, imperfectly, but truly. Yes, gentleness can survive. Yes, moral seriousness can remain compassionate. Yes, a person may endure grief without becoming bitter. Yes, humility can stand in the center of power. Yes, quiet leadership can change history. Now the time is very late. The story that began by a frontier fire comes to rest in a softer, larger light. Imagine one final time a lamp in a window, not bright enough to dazzle, only bright enough to guide. Outside, the night is deep. The road is long. The world remains troubled, as worlds always do. But there in the window is a steady flame, small, clear, unwasted. And those traveling in darkness look toward it and remember that not all strength announces itself with thunder. Some strength sits quietly. Some strength reads and listens and waits. Some strength speaks only when speech has ripened into truth. Some strength carries sorrow with dignity. Some strength, even after death, continues to warm the age it has left behind. That is the lamp Abraham Lincoln left burning. And now, because this is a sleep story, you may let the figure of him soften. Not vanish, only soften. The outlines of the face, the tall frame, the thoughtful eyes, the worn but gentle expression, all of it easing now into memory, into history. into that deep interior place where the lives of the wise continue to keep company with the living. The room grows quieter, the fire burns low, the nation, with all its wounds and hopes, recedes into distance. And what remains nearest is not tragedy alone, but tenderness. Not power alone, but conscience. Not fame alone, but character. So rest now with the wisdom of quiet leadership. Rest with the child of wood smoke and wilderness. Rest with the lawyer who listened. Rest with the father who grieved. Rest with the president who chose mercy over malice. Rest with the man who tried, in the hardest of times, to bind the wounds of a broken people. Let his story settle over you like evening. Let it grow calm in your mind. Let it become not only something remembered, but something felt. And as sleep draws nearer, as thought loosens, as the long day finally leaves you, may you carry with you this simple, enduring grace, that the truest power is often quiet, that the deepest wisdom is often gentle, and that one lamp, faithfully tended, can shine far beyond the life of the hand that lit it. Good night.